Hello there, welcome to the very first story in our series, Boring History for Sleep. Tonight, we begin with a quiet tale from long ago, the slow decline of the Roman Republic. Before we begin, I invite you to gently lower the volume to a soft, comfortable level. Close your eyes, lie still, let the day drift away, and allow your breath to settle into a slow, gentle rhythm. There's nothing you need to do, nowhere you need to be, just you and this story. If you find comfort in these sleepy tales, feel free to give this video a like and subscribe so you can return each night to a new journey through forgotten history, told ever so slowly. Now, let's begin. Long before the grandeur of emperors, marble palaces, and the legendary might of the Roman Empire, there stood a republic. Fragile, ambitious, and surprisingly human. The Roman Republic was not born fully formed. It grew over centuries, slowly and sometimes painfully, from a small collection of Latin-speaking settlements clustered around the banks of the Tiber River. In the early days, Rome was ruled by kings, but by the late 6th century BCE, those kings were cast out. The Romans, suspicious of monarchy and what they saw as tyranny, formed a republic, a res publica, a public affair. It was a government where power was shared, balanced, and often fiercely debated. The Senate became the heart of Roman politics, composed mostly of aristocratic families or patricians, who traced their ancestry back to the founding of Rome. But not all citizens had equal voices. The struggle between the patricians and the commoners, the plebeians, would shape much of the Republic's early centuries. At its core, the Republic was a system of checks and balances. 2 consuls were elected each year, holding the highest office in the land. They could veto each other, preventing any one man from becoming too powerful. Underneath them were magistrates, tribunes, and of course, the Senate, an advisory body with significant influence. But while the Republic aimed for fairness, cracks formed early on. Rome expanded rapidly, first conquering nearby Italian tribes, then stretching across the Mediterranean. With each conquest came wealth, enormous wealth, and also new problems. Generals returning from campaigns brought gold, slaves, and glory. But they also brought ambition. The Republic had not been designed for empire. The Senate struggled to manage provinces far from Rome. Corruption seeped in, as governors used their positions to extract wealth for personal gain. Meanwhile, the gap between rich and poor in Rome widened dramatically. Large estates called latifundia took over much of the countryside, worked by slaves captured in war. Small farmers, the backbone of the Republic, found themselves pushed out, bankrupt, or forced to move to the crowded city of Rome. There, they became dependent on grain handouts and easily swayed by charismatic leaders. One such leader was the reformer Tiberius Gracchus. A tribune of the plebs in 133 BCE, he proposed redistributing land to the poor, challenging the Senate's authority. He was met with fierce resistance. Eventually, Tiberius was killed, clubbed to death in a riot sparked by his opponents. It was the first time blood had been shed in Roman politics in centuries. His brother Gaius followed in his footsteps a decade later, with similar reforms and a similar fate. These 2 deaths marked a chilling turning point. From then on, political violence became more common. Trust eroded. Rome's institutions no longer felt sacred. The idea that disagreements should be resolved through debate, not bloodshed, began to vanish. Meanwhile, powerful generals continued to rise. Gaius Marius, a man of humble origin, reformed the military by allowing landless men to serve in the legions. These soldiers, once loyal to the Republic, now owed their loyalty to their general, the man who paid them, fed them, and promised them land. Marius became immensely powerful, and his enemies grew nervous. One of them was Lucius Cornelius Sulla. The rivalry between Marius and Sulla led to civil war. For the first time in Roman history, a Roman army marched on Rome itself. Cities were sacked, enemies were proscribed, declared outlaws, hunted down, and killed. When Sulla eventually seized control, he declared himself dictator, not just for a short emergency period, but indefinitely. He claimed to be restoring the Republic. In truth, he had broken it further. Though he eventually stepped down, the precedent was set. The door to autocracy had been opened. In the quiet aftermath of Sulla's reign, Rome tried to return to normal, but it was never quite the same. The Senate, weakened and fearful, clung to the past. Meanwhile, The people were restless. The balance had shifted. Men like Pompey, Crassus, and eventually Julius Caesar began to see that power was no longer in the institutions. It was in popularity, in wealth, in military strength. The Republic still stood, but its foundation had been shaken. The slow decline had begun, not with a bang, but with many small cracks forming in the stone. And though Rome still called itself a republic, the reality was starting to look very different. After Sulla's dictatorship, Rome returned to its republican rituals. The Senate held sessions, magistrates were elected, tribunes gave speeches, but the soul of the republic had shifted. Beneath the surface, trust had frayed. Old rules were remembered, but the reverence behind them was fading. Ambition grew bolder. Violence no longer shocked. The balance between Senate authority and popular will had been broken, and charismatic leaders knew how to exploit this divide. Among them was Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great. A favored general of Sulla, Pompey built his fame through military conquests in Sicily, Spain, and the East. Though young and without the traditional political experience, he demanded and received extraordinary powers from the Senate. He returned to Rome as a hero, flush with victory and wealth, expecting political reward. But the Senate hesitated. Jealousy and fear kept them from granting him the land distributions and ratifications he requested. Frustrated, Pompey turned to an unlikely ally, Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, and Gaius Julius Caesar, a rising politician with immense popular appeal. Together, they formed what would be known as the First Triumvirate, an unofficial alliance that bypassed the Senate and concentrated power in their hands. This alliance signaled another step in the Republic's unraveling. Laws were passed not through open debate, but through coercion, threats, and backroom deals. Caesar, supported by Pompey and Crassus, was elected consul in 59 BCE. During his term, he passed sweeping reforms, often against fierce resistance. When his year ended, Caesar left for Gaul as governor, and there his legend grew. Over nearly a decade, Caesar conquered vast lands, subjugated tribes, and brought immense wealth back to Rome. But more than anything, he brought fear. He now commanded a loyal, battle-hardened army. Back in Rome, Crassus had died in battle in the east, and Pompey, growing wary of Caesar's power, aligned himself with the Senate. The balance of power was shifting again. In 49 BCE, Caesar was ordered by the Senate to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. He refused. Instead, he marched his army across the Rubicon River, a direct act of war against the Republic. "The die is cast," he is said to have muttered. What followed was another civil war. Caesar, moving swiftly and decisively, defeated Pompey's forces. Pompey fled to Egypt, where he was assassinated. Caesar followed, entangling himself in the politics of the Ptolemaic court. He famously aligned with Cleopatra, returning to Rome not just as a general, but as a symbol of unstoppable ambition. In Rome, Caesar was appointed dictator, then dictator for 10 years, then dictator for life. He enacted reforms, many of them popular, revamping the calendar, restructuring debt, expanding the Senate. But for many, the symbolism was too much. Statues of Caesar were placed alongside those of gods. His image appeared on coins. He wore the purple robe of kingship. Whispers grew louder. The Republic was dead in all but name. On the Ides of March 44 BCE, Caesar entered the Senate chamber. A group of senators, led by Brutus and Cassius, stabbed him to death. They believed they were saving the Republic, but they were too late. Caesar's assassination unleashed chaos. Rome descended into yet another round of civil wars. The conspirators were hunted down. Power shifted again, this time to Caesar's grandnephew and adopted son, Octavian. Alongside Mark Antony and Lepidus, Octavian formed the Second Triumvirate, a legal three-man dictatorship. The Senate was sidelined. Prescriptions returned. Enemies of the regime were eliminated. Eventually, conflict erupted between Antony and Octavian. Their final confrontation came at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE. Octavian emerged victorious. Antony and Cleopatra took their own lives. The Republic, bruised and hollow, no longer stood in his way. In 27 BCE, Octavian took the title Augustus. He carefully maintained the facade of the Republic, refusing to be called king, acting through the Senate, but the truth was clear. He held absolute power. The Roman Republic had given way to the Roman Empire, and it had not fallen overnight. It had declined slowly through a series of choices, missteps, and ambitions. With every civil war, every reform bypassing the Senate, every concentration of power in a single man's hands, the Republic faded until only the rituals remained. The decline was not just political, it was emotional. The belief in shared governance, in debate and restraint, had been eroded. The Republic had been a fragile experiment, remarkable for its time, but vulnerable to the very forces it had tried to restrain: greed, pride, fear, and the hunger for glory. And though Rome would go on to achieve even greater splendor under the emperors, the quiet fall of the Republic would linger in memory as both a warning and a lesson whispered through history, that even the strongest institutions can be undone, not by a single blow, but by the slow accumulation of cracks left unsealed. After the fall of the Republic and the rise of Augustus, many Romans found themselves in a strange and unfamiliar world. The forms of the old system were still visible. The Senate met, elections were held, laws were passed, but the substance had shifted. The Republic was no longer a living organism. It had become a carefully preserved shell. Augustus, ever the master of appearances, ruled with subtlety. He understood that openly seizing power would provoke resistance, so he cloaked his authority in tradition. He called himself princeps, the first citizen, not king or emperor, though in practice, his word was final. He claimed to restore the Republic, but his reforms centralized control under his hand. He held the powers of consul, tribune, and censor. He controlled the military, the treasury, and most provincial appointments. Through patronage and careful management, Augustus ensured loyalty among both the Senate and the people. He maintained peace, what later historians would call the Pax Romana, and with peace came prosperity. Roads were built, grain flowed into the city, temples were restored, and the arts flourished. Many welcomed this new order. After decades of civil war, chaos, and bloodshed, the quiet rule of one man felt like relief. But beneath the surface, the transformation was profound. The idea that Rome was governed by law, by collective decision-making, by a rotating body of officials accountable to the public, all of this faded into memory. Instead, Rome now lived under the rule of dynasty. When Augustus died in 14 CE, his adopted son Tiberius succeeded him. There was no formal election, no contest, only imperial succession cloaked in senatorial approval. Tiberius was capable, but withdrawn and suspicious. He ruled from the island of Capri in his later years, far from the people, surrounded by intrigue. His reign marked the beginning of a troubling pattern: emperors who wielded immense power without equal oversight. Some were wise and restrained, others were paranoid, cruel, or incompetent. The Senate, once a proud body of statesmen, became a ceremonial council. Senators feared the emperor's wrath and often acted more as courtiers than lawmakers. When Caligula came to power, he indulged in extravagance and delusion. He demanded divine honors, appointed his horse as a priest, and ruled with reckless abandon. His assassination was plotted not by foreign enemies, but by his own guards. Nero followed years later, infamous for his artistic vanity, his persecution of Christians, and his suspected role in the Great Fire of Rome. The Senate had no real way to remove such men. The people had no vote to cast. The Republic, in its truest sense, had no voice. And yet, in dusty archives and fading memories, stories of the Republic remained. Cato the Younger, who chose suicide over submission to Caesar. Cicero, whose speeches against tyranny echoed long after his death. The Gracchi brothers, who had tried to lift the poor. Marius, Sulla, Pompey, Caesar, names that had once commanded armies and audiences, were now remembered with a mix of awe and sorrow. These figures became symbols not only of Rome's greatness, but of the tensions that tore it apart. They reminded those who still studied history that the Republic's fall had not been inevitable. It had been a choice, repeated again and again, to trade freedom for order, debate for decree, and uncertainty for control. As the imperial system solidified, new generations of Romans were born into a world that had never known the Republic. They grew up under emperors, attended public games funded by imperial generosity, and cheered for leaders they had never chosen. They heard tales of a time when Rome's fate was decided in public forums, when tribunes spoke for the people, and when magistrates were held accountable. But these were stories from another world, as distant as myths. Over time, the ideals of the Republic faded from daily life. Its decline was no longer an active memory. It became background, a soft shadow behind the grandeur of empire. And yet it lingered, like the quiet echo of a forgotten song. In dusty scrolls and marble inscriptions, in crumbling Senate buildings and quiet corners of the Forum, the Republic waited. Not for resurrection, perhaps, but for remembrance. It had not died all at once. It had slipped away slowly, like a twilight that deepens without anyone noticing. The sun had not fallen from the sky. It had simply been swallowed by the night, moment by moment, degree by quiet degree. And for those who still closed their eyes and listened carefully, there were lessons to be heard, not shouted from balconies or carved into monuments, but whispered softly, patiently, like the Roman wind moving through ruins long after the crowds had gone. As the Republic faded further into memory, Rome became a city of statues, shadows, and ceremony. The emperors walked through marble halls lined with symbols of a past they no longer served, while the people filled amphitheaters and festivals funded by the state, their voices cheering not for civic ideals, but for spectacle. Still, whispers of the Republic's principles occasionally stirred, though softly, like wind rustling dry laurel leaves. It is worth pausing to consider how such a grand political experiment, one that lasted nearly 5 centuries, could decline not with dramatic collapse, but through gradual erosion. In truth, the mechanisms of that erosion were complex, woven into every corner of Roman life. One of the most powerful forces in the Republic's decay was the slow, almost invisible growth of dependency on powerful individuals. The original Roman system thrived on shared responsibility, on magistrates who rotated in and out of office, on laws passed through debate. But over time, the population grew used to the generosity of singular figures, men like Caesar, Pompey, and later Augustus, who could offer food, land, and entertainment more quickly and effectively than any governing body. The grain dole, once a stopgap for those in dire need, became a regular lifeline. Public games, originally tied to religious festivals, turned into massive political tools. Gladiators fought not for honor, but for the political ambitions of those sponsoring the games. Bread and circuses, as the poet Juvenal would later call them, became a substitute for participation. Citizens who once took pride in electing consuls and tribunes now looked instead to the emperor's face, on a coin, to know where power lay. The Senate, meanwhile, hollowed itself out. It still met, still debated, still passed resolutions, but the courage to resist imperial wishes grew rare. When emperors like Tiberius, Nero, or Domitian turned suspicious or cruel, the Senate often responded not with opposition, but with lavish praise and flattery. Senators became eager to offer temples, titles, and statues to the reigning emperor, hoping to secure favor, or at least avoid suspicion. The rituals remained, but the heart had changed. Another quiet contributor to the Republic's demise was the shift in military loyalty. During the early Republic, soldiers were citizen farmers, conscripted for temporary service, returning to their land after campaigns. They fought for Rome, for family, for duty. But as Rome expanded and military campaigns grew longer, the composition of the army shifted. Landless men joined the legions, hoping for wealth and land grants after service. They depended not on the Senate, but on their generals. A man like Marius or Caesar could command fierce loyalty by providing for their men directly, bypassing the traditional Republican hierarchy. Over time, soldiers came to view their general, not the Republic, as their leader. This shift made civil wars not just possible, but likely. When armies followed men instead of institutions, Rome became vulnerable to internal conquest. And still, the Republic's decline continued, not in dramatic collapses, but in quiet accommodations. Each breach of tradition was rationalized. Each power grabbed was justified as necessary. Each erosion of processes was accepted in exchange for peace or prosperity. The people, weary from instability, allowed it. The Senate, weakened and divided, permitted it. And the emperors, cloaked in the language of restoration, enacted it. Even language itself began to shift. Terms like liberty, virtue, and res publica were still spoken, but they no longer carried the same weight. They became nostalgic, ceremonial, part of speeches rather than lived experiences. Cicero had once thundered about the rule of law and the defense of the Republic. But now, law was what the emperor said it was. And yet, even in this changing world, fragments of the old Republic survived. In distant provinces, governors still carried out duties in the name of Roman order. In family homes, fathers still taught sons about Cincinnatus and Brutus, about sacrifice and public service. The stories were quieter now, softened by time, but they remained. And it is perhaps in those quiet stories that the Republic truly lived on. For while Rome changed on the surface, its forms more crowded, its emperors more powerful, its palaces more ornate, the ideals of the Republic had not disappeared completely. They had simply been buried beneath layers of time, tradition, and adaptation. They slept within the stones of the curia, beneath the dust of old tablets, in the faded ink of senatorial decrees. They lingered in memory, not as active forces, but as silent witnesses. In the centuries to come, those memories would flicker again. In the writings of philosophers, in the debates of foreign thinkers, and in the slow reawakening of Republican thought far beyond Rome. But for now, in the age of emperors and marble grandeur, the Republic lay still. Not dead, but resting, as if waiting for someone to remember not just what it had become, but what it had once meant. And so the story continues, not with revolution, but with reverence. A long, slow fading into the background of history, where silence speaks as loudly as words, and where the fall of a republic is not marked by thunder, but by the stillness that follows. As the centuries passed and the emperors continued to rule from marble halls, the republic became more of a memory than a model. Yet like a long-forgotten melody that occasionally hums beneath the surface of a dream, its spirit never fully vanished. While the emperors held real power, the echoes of the old system lingered in language, in rituals, and in the architecture of Roman life. The Senate still met, though often only to endorse what the emperor had already decided. Consuls were still elected, though their duties were largely ceremonial. Tribunes still bore their sacred title, though few dared to use their veto against imperial policy. And while Rome's political center had shifted toward autocracy, the old ideals were occasionally invoked, especially when emperors sought to connect their rule with the virtue and glory of Rome's past. Emperors like Trajan and Hadrian styled themselves not only as rulers, but as restorers of Roman values. They built libraries, funded temples, and expanded infrastructure, often speaking of justice, order, and the common good. But these gestures were top-down, curated performances of republican virtue, no longer the messy participatory struggle that once defined the early republic. In the provinces, Roman governance continued to function with surprising stability. Local elites were co-opted into the imperial system, serving as magistrates and administrators, spreading Roman law, culture, and language. In this way, the republic lived on in practice, through town councils, civic rituals, and the legal codes that originated in republican times. But the heart of political life, the fierce debates, the balance of powers, the accountability to the people, had grown silent. And yet, silence does not always mean absence. Across time and space, the Roman Republic's story was preserved by historians, philosophers, and legal scholars who refused to let it fade completely. Writers like Tacitus, who lived under the empire, looked back on the Republic not with blind admiration, but with a mixture of nostalgia and warning. In his annals, he described the Senate's decline, the corrosion of liberty, and the quiet submission of a people who had once been fiercely independent. He saw in the empire a paradox: peace without freedom, prosperity without participation. To Tacitus and others, the fall of the Republic was not merely a political shift, it was a transformation of the Roman soul. Later thinkers across the ages would return to this moment in history, drawn to its complexity. They would ask, how could a civilization so advanced, so admired, and so powerful let go of its founding principles? How could institutions designed to prevent tyranny ultimately pave the way for it? The answers were rarely simple. Some pointed to greed, others to fear, and still others to the slow exhaustion of public virtue. The truth may lie in the very nature of power, that when left unchecked, even in the name of stability or glory, it tends to concentrate, accumulate, and over time, silence the many in favor of the few. Still, there was another lesson hidden in the Republic's long twilight, that ideas, no matter how bruised, buried, or betrayed, can endure. They can sleep quietly beneath the weight of empires, and one day they can wake again. For centuries after its fall, the Republic remained a symbol. Renaissance thinkers in Italy would rediscover Cicero and Cato, drawing inspiration from their words to challenge the authority of kings. In England, during times of civil unrest, writers would reference Roman history to justify new forms of governance. And across the Atlantic, as 13 colonies debated their future, the ghost of the Roman Republic found its way into their founding documents. Its structure, its warnings, and its aspirations helped shape new republics, reborn in distant lands. Of course, these new systems were not copies. They were reinventions, molded by different times and cultures. But the spirit, the longing for a government by the people, for the people, under law, was unmistakably Roman in its roots. And so, the decline of the Roman Republic was not the end of an idea. It was the beginning of a longer conversation, one that would stretch across continents and centuries. Even now, the Republic speaks, not in the booming voice of triumph, but in the quieter tone of reflection. It reminds us that freedom is fragile, that institutions require vigilance, and that even the most enduring powers can fall if they forget why they were built. In that way, the Republic never truly died. It simply passed into history, where its rise and fall could be studied not just as events, but as lessons. And tonight, in the stillness of this quiet hour, its story rests with you, not to awaken conflict, but to soothe the mind with the slow, solemn rhythm of a past long gone, and yet somehow still present, a tale of order and ambition, of voices raised and silenced, of a city that once governed itself before it chose to be governed. The Republic sleeps now, but its dreams linger, in books, in buildings, in memory. And in moments like this, as the world fades into slumber, we listen and remember. The story of the Roman Republic's slow decline is not merely a tale of political institutions or ambitious generals. It is a quiet unfolding of human nature, tested by power, time, and memory. In its earliest days, Rome was nothing more than a modest settlement on the banks of the Tiber. It had no grand monuments, no sweeping armies, and no claim to greatness. What it did have, however, was a deep suspicion of kingship and a fierce belief in shared rule. After driving out their last monarch, the Romans did something unusual. They chose to limit the power of the individual. 2 consuls, elected annually, shared executive duties. Laws were passed through public assemblies. The Senate, while unelected, served as a body of experience and counsel. It was far from perfect. Class divisions ran deep, and political rights were limited, but for its time, it was remarkably ambitious. And it worked. Slowly, Rome grew, not just through war, but through resilience. It faced invasions, internal revolts, and economic hardship. Yet it adapted. Institutions evolved, compromises were struck, and civic life flourished. The Republic endured not because it was unchallenged, but because it had built-in flexibility. But over time, that flexibility began to thin. As Rome expanded beyond Italy, new challenges emerged, governing distant provinces, managing wealth, and balancing the ambitions of rising elites. The Republic, designed for a city-state, now stretched across continents. Its political structure, once nimble, became strained. Senators who once oversaw domestic affairs now governed regions they could barely visit. The bureaucracy struggled to keep pace, and in that gap between expansion and administration, a new kind of Roman emerged: the powerful general statesman. Men like Pompey and Caesar rose not just through elections, but through battlefield glory. They returned to Rome with riches, soldiers, and public adoration. And with each of them, the old boundaries blurred. The people, weary of corruption and instability, welcomed these men as saviors. The Senate, fearful of their influence, resisted them, sometimes half-heartedly, sometimes with outright hostility. These confrontations turned political tensions into armed conflicts, and with every march on Rome, with every set of prescriptions, with every emergency decree, the Republic was weakened, not in name, but in spirit. It is important to remember that most Romans did not notice the decline in dramatic terms. To many, life went on, markets remained open, roads were patrolled, the calendar turned, temples held their ceremonies, and children learned of Rome's founding myths. The institutions still existed. The vocabulary of the Republic remained. What changed was the invisible current, the sense that power now flowed from a single person, not from collective will. That laws followed authority, not the other way around. That fear had replaced debate. In moments of calm, this might have seemed acceptable. Augustus brought peace. Trajan brought glory. Hadrian brought culture. But these were exceptions, not guarantees. The emperors were not bound by law in the way consuls once were. If they were wise, Rome prospered. If they were cruel, Rome suffered. The people had little recourse. They could cheer, they could mourn, but they could not choose. This is perhaps the quietest part of the Republic's decline. The fading of responsibility. In a true republic, citizens bear some burden. They vote, they argue, they compromise, they serve. It is not always efficient, but it is participatory. Under the empire, that burden shifted. The emperor bore the weight. The people watched. Bread was distributed, games were performed, temples were funded, but civic engagement, the rough and noble duty of self-government, diminished. Over generations, this shift reshaped Roman identity. Patriotism became loyalty to the emperor, not to the state. Virtue was measured by obedience, not independence. And history, once a record of public service and sacrifice, became a gallery of imperial portraits. Still, within the quiet corners of Roman life, some remembered. Philosophers debated ethics. Jurists preserved legal traditions. Writers like Plutarch and Suetonius recorded lives from the past, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with sorrow. Their work kept the Republic from vanishing entirely. And while Rome's streets filled with triumphal arches and statues of emperors, somewhere, perhaps in a scholar's study or a father's evening story, the memory of the Republic lived on. It waited, not to be restored, but to be understood. For the fall of the Roman Republic was not a single act, but a long sequence of small, accepted changes. Each seemed justifiable, each addressed a need, but together they turned a republic into an empire. And the most sobering truth is this: the people let it happen, not out of malice, but out of exhaustion, not with anger, but with quiet acquiescence. It is a story not of villains and heroes, but of choices, slow, silent, and deeply human. Choices that still echo across time into the present. As the Roman Empire marched steadily through the centuries, it carried with it the bones of a fallen republic. Some were preserved in tradition, others hollowed out and redefined, but they remained, like ruins quietly standing beside newer, shinier buildings. To understand how the republic lingered, even in decay, we must look at how memory was managed, how history itself was shaped, retold, and sometimes manipulated to serve the present. Emperors, recognizing the power of legacy, often sought to wrap themselves in the garb of old republican virtue. They called upon the imagery of the past, holding consular office, celebrating triumphs, and commissioning statues in the Forum, to associate themselves with Rome's founding ideals. But these were controlled echoes, carefully curated. Augustus, for example, insisted on being called princeps rather than rex, first among equals, not a king. He restored temples and encouraged religious revival, all while holding ultimate control. His reign was a performance of republican nostalgia, choreographed to comfort those who feared monarchy, while quietly concentrating power. This duality became a pattern. Later emperors built libraries and arches, named years after consuls, and celebrated senatorial titles, but few ever yielded real authority. And while many Romans may have welcomed the peace and order the emperors brought, some sensed the trade that had occurred. Beneath the surface of civic life, a different kind of education began to take shape. Elite Roman families, especially those involved in governance or literature, began to emphasize Roman history as a moral tale. Young men were taught to study figures like Cincinnatus, the humble farmer who once accepted absolute power only to give it back. They read Cicero's speeches and were reminded of Brutus, who raised his dagger against tyranny. These stories were not just history, they were quiet commentaries on the world as it had become. And so, while the institutions faded, the idea of the Republic became something more philosophical. It survived not in action, but in principle. It became a lens through which later generations could evaluate their own world. Was justice still possible without shared power? Could virtue survive in an age of spectacle? Could one man truly act for the common good? Or was he always tempted by glory? These questions were not just academic. They became the silent pulse of Roman literature and thought. Even under the empire's height, writers like Seneca and Epictetus hinted at these tensions, not directly political, but ethical. They asked what it meant to be free within a system that no longer invited participation. And though their answers varied, the questions themselves mattered. For the Republic's decline was not only a political event, it was a transformation of civic imagination. In earlier times, to be Roman meant to serve, to vote, to debate, to sacrifice. Under the empire, being Roman meant belonging, obeying, and benefiting from imperial order. The difference may seem subtle, but it reached deep into the heart of identity. Rome had become less of a republic and more of a spectacle, a place where greatness was displayed, not built together, where decisions were made for the people, not by them, where virtue was admired in marble, but rarely practiced in office. Yet still, the republic's ghost remained, not angry, not resentful, just present, in dusty scrolls, in crumbling columns, in the quiet rituals that outlived their meaning. Even the calendar itself, reformed by Caesar, bore the marks of its political past. Months named after rulers, years counted from consular terms. And in that quiet persistence, the Republic whispered its final lesson, that no system, no matter how noble, survives untouched by time. That ideals, even when written into law, depend on the will of those who carry them. That freedom is not simply granted, it is practiced, protected, and above all, remembered. And perhaps that is the deepest truth hidden in Rome's long twilight. The Republic did not vanish. It simply changed form, from structure to story, from law to legend. It became a memory carried through generations, a lesson told beside the fire, a warning passed from parent to child. Not to return to the past, but to learn from it. For even in stillness, history breathes. It waits not for resurrection, but for understanding. It invites us to look inward, to ask what kind of citizens we are, what kind of world we accept, and what we might yet choose to build. The Roman Republic may be gone, but its story endures, quietly, patiently, like the turning of old pages in a forgotten library. A slow, deliberate rhythm, a voice just beneath the surface, saying not remember us, but remember why. By the time the Roman Empire had reached its peak, its borders stretching from the forests of Germania to the deserts of Arabia, from the cliffs of Britannia to the sands of North Africa, the idea of the Republic had become distant, almost mythical. Few living citizens could recall its structure, fewer still had lived under it, and yet it remained a quiet presence in Rome's cultural memory. The emperors who followed Augustus styled themselves not just as rulers, but as guardians of Rome's greatness. They commissioned sculptures of Republican heroes, rebuilt monuments to ancient victories, and preserved ceremonial roles that traced back to the days when Rome was a state of laws rather than of men. But this reverence was selective. It honored the surface, not the substance. The Emperor Trajan, widely considered one of the most competent rulers, was often referred to as Optimus Princeps, the best ruler. He was praised for consulting the Senate, for respecting traditional institutions, and for ruling with a sense of justice. But even Trajan held extraordinary powers, unbound by electoral limits or legal opposition. The system had evolved, or perhaps devolved, into a monarchy in all but name. And that evolution was not accidental. It was, in many ways, a response to the challenges that the Republic could no longer manage. As Rome grew larger, more complex, and more diverse, the old mechanisms of shared power and local governance strained under the pressure. A single authority, one voice to command, one figure to hold responsible, offered simplicity. The Senate was too slow, too divided, too provincial. The assemblies had become crowded and chaotic, easy to sway with promises or spectacle. It seemed to many that Rome needed the emperors. But in choosing centralization over consensus, Rome paid a price. That price was not immediate suffering nor sudden collapse. It was something quieter, a gradual thinning of civic life, a cooling of the public flame. Citizens became subjects. Public duty turned into passive loyalty. And over time, the muscle of self-governance, once Rome's defining strength, began to atrophy. In the streets of the capital, the change was subtle. Festivals continued. The forum still bustled with merchants and officials. Schoolboys recited the virtues of Horatius and the speeches of Cicero. The Vestal virgins maintained their sacred flame. But the deeper structure, the one that gave meaning to those rituals, was gone. No longer did Romans elect their magistrates with weighty debates in the comitia. No longer did tribunes stand before the crowd to halt unjust laws. No longer did the Senate carry the moral force to check a powerful leader. Instead, decisions flowed downward. Edicts were issued from the Palatine Hill. Governors were appointed by imperial favor. Praetorian guards whispered in palace corridors, sometimes shaping the very fate of emperors themselves. Power had become personal. And once power becomes personal, stability depends not on law, but on the character of the one who holds it. This led to cycles of greatness and disaster. A wise emperor could bring peace, reform taxes, and defend the frontiers. A cruel one could plunge the empire into terror. And the people, once participants in shaping their world, could do little more than watch. Some resisted quietly through satire or subtle critique. Poets like Juvenal hinted at moral decay, at a society more interested in bread and circuses than in liberty. Philosophers urged a return to inner virtue, to stoic detachment, to personal discipline in the face of political helplessness. Others embraced the empire, grateful for its roads, its aqueducts, its grain shipments. They saw in the emperor a paternal figure, distant but dependable, flawed but necessary. And perhaps they were not wrong. For even as the Republic faded, Rome continued to function, to build, to inspire. The question was never about collapse. It was about transformation, and transformation often carries both loss and gain. The Republic had offered voice, but also division. It allowed freedom, but also instability. The empire brought order, but at the cost of agency. It offered prosperity, but at the expense of principle. These trade-offs were not always visible. They lived in the rhythm of daily life, in how people spoke, what they hoped for, what they feared. The Republic had once taught Romans to expect struggle, to value civic virtue, to honor sacrifice for the common good. The empire taught them to expect protection, entertainment, and stability. One required effort, the other offered comfort. And in the long, slow unfolding of history, comfort often wins. But the memory of effort, of striving together, of disagreeing without violence, of building institutions larger than any one man, remained tucked inside the Roman soul, quiet, dormant, waiting for a different age to call it back. As Rome moved deeper into its imperial age, the Republic became a symbol more than a system, an image often invoked but rarely understood. To the common Roman, the phrase Senatus Populusque Romanus, the Senate and people of Rome, still appeared on monuments and military standards. It was etched into the arches of triumph, stamped onto coins, and spoken in ceremonial declarations. But the true collaboration between Senate and people, once the foundation of Rome's governance, had faded into hollow ritual. What had once been a political force was now a ceremonial echo. The Senate still wore its robes, the consuls still processed through the city on special days, but their influence was tightly managed. Real power lived elsewhere, behind palace walls, in imperial chambers, in the whisper of a Praetorian commander, or the sealed scrolls of a provincial report. And yet, beneath the surface of power and policy, the Republic still had something to teach, not through politics, but through legacy. The values that had once animated the Republic, discipline, duty, balance, and shared sacrifice, had not disappeared entirely. They lived on in the expectations of civic behavior, in the stories fathers told their sons, in the quiet admiration for ancestors who once held fast to principle, even in danger. Roman funerals, particularly among the elite, preserved these ideals in haunting ways. When a distinguished citizen died, actors would wear wax masks of his ancestors, walking silently in the procession, their faces frozen in the expressions of past glory. Each mask represented not just a man, but a time, a reminder that the Republic had once been alive in these very streets, these very names. In this way, Rome did not bury its past, it walked with it. Even as emperors rose and fell, often violently, the Republic endured as a silent witness. The Forum remained a place of gathering, though no longer of debate. The Rostra still stood, though its speakers no longer challenged injustice. The Curia, once filled with impassioned voices, became quiet, polished, maintained, but subdued. Tourists from the provinces might have marveled at the spectacle, unaware that these stones once trembled beneath the weight of true argument. Even among Rome's scholars and poets, the memory of the Republic evolved. It was no longer seen merely as a political system, but as a lost age of moral clarity, idealized, perhaps unfairly, but powerful nonetheless. The historian Livy wrote of Rome's early days with both admiration and grief, presenting a time when citizens acted with courage, when laws mattered more than personalities, when ambition was balanced by restraint. His work was not a call to rebellion. It was a quiet plea to remember. The philosopher Seneca, living under Nero's rule, turned inward. He wrote of stoic endurance, of cultivating virtue in the face of injustice, of holding one's mind free even when the world was not. His words were meant to guide the soul through treacherous waters, a compass for those who could no longer shape politics but refused to let go of principles. And this, perhaps, became the Republic's final gift. In its absence, it taught future generations how to think about freedom, not just as a structure of government, but as a condition of the spirit. It showed that participation matters, that accountability matters, that unchecked power, no matter how well-intentioned, erodes the soul of a people. It also offered a long view of history. The Republic had lasted for centuries, evolving, expanding, stumbling, but enduring. And then slowly, it had changed. Not because one man declared it over, but because millions of small decisions, over time, allowed it to drift. The people grew tired, the Senate grew complacent, the generals grew bold, and the balance tilted, not in a single moment, but gradually. Like a tide receding so slowly that no one noticed the shore had changed until it was far behind them. Rome itself never stopped being grand. The architecture, the engineering, the military prowess, all continued under the empire. But something less visible had been lost, a habit of thought, a posture of civic responsibility, a belief in argument, in consensus, in duty above desire. And so, when later republics were born, whether in the city-states of Renaissance Italy, the revolution halls of France, or the founding of a new nation across the ocean, they did not begin from nothing. They began from Rome, from the Republic's rise and fall, from its lessons, written not just in law, but in loss. The Republic of Rome was never perfect. It was often unjust, often flawed. But it was, for a time, something rare, a large, growing, complex state that placed limits on power, that believed in the rule of law, that allowed its people a voice. And in remembering it, later generations found not just a model, but a mirror, a way to reflect on their own systems, their own choices, their own future. That is the enduring power of the Republic, not in what it was, but in what it continues to ask us. What will you do with your power? What will you preserve? What will you let slip away? The decline of the Roman Republic did not simply mark the end of a political era. It became a blueprint, a shadow, and a silent reference point for every future civilization wrestling with the balance between liberty and control. In the centuries after the Republic's fall, as emperors ruled and Rome transformed into a vast and deeply layered empire, the question of what had been lost slowly began to crystallize. Not everyone asked it aloud. Most people simply lived within the world that now was, paying taxes, following edicts, serving in legions, attending games, and praying to the gods of state. But among those who studied the past, who walked through the forum with thoughtful eyes or read the dusty scrolls in quiet libraries, there was an awareness that something had slipped away, not in a fiery collapse, but in a slow, creeping quiet. That awareness formed the foundation for Rome's later thinkers, who did not shout their observations but whispered them in philosophy, in letters, in carefully crafted histories. The Republic, though dead in structure, lived on in language. It became a concept, a mythic time of shared sacrifice and civic virtue. It was remembered as a world where citizens served, not submitted, where laws ruled, not men. And while this memory was often idealized, ignoring the Republic's deep inequalities, its class struggles, and its internal corruption, it still offered a North Star to those seeking meaning in a world of autocracy. The Roman Republic's greatest gift, perhaps, was not in what it achieved while alive, but in what it taught in its absence. It left behind a long corridor of questions, stretching through centuries, inviting reflection rather than instruction. Could power ever be truly shared? Could ambition be restrained without stifling action? Could a society thrive not just on order, but on participation, accountability, and trust? These questions did not end in Rome. They traveled. They crossed borders, languages, and epochs. In medieval Italy, city-states like Florence and Venice invoked republican ideals as they struggled to build stable self-rule. In England, debates over parliament and monarchy often echoed Roman themes. In the Enlightenment, as political philosophy bloomed across Europe, writers and revolutionaries returned again and again to the Republic, not as nostalgia, but as a warning. The American founding fathers studied Cicero and Cato, read Livy and Tacitus, and debated how to construct a republic that could endure where Rome had faltered. They knew that Rome's Senate had been noble but timid, that its citizens had grown passive, and that its laws had been swept aside when fear outweighed principle. And so they built systems of checks and balances, term limits, and constitutional rights, not because they believed history would not repeat itself, but because they knew it often does. In that way, the Roman Republic never entirely disappeared. It transformed. It became part of the intellectual and moral framework of the modern world. Its ghosts whisper not just in classrooms or museums, but in courtrooms, in parliaments, in protests, in the simple but profound act of casting a vote. And still, it teaches, quietly, gently, patiently. It teaches that liberty is not inherited, but cultivated. That democracy is not a destination, but a discipline. That institutions, no matter how strong, are only as enduring as the values of those who uphold them. Rome's republic was born out of rebellion against kingship. It survived wars, class conflict, and foreign invasion. But in the end, it faded not from external pressure, but from within. It failed not from a single betrayal, but from the repeated erosion of trust, the slow sacrifice of principle for expedience, and the willingness of people to look away when power concentrated in the hands of the few. This is not a tale of villains. It is a tale of humans, imperfect, burdened by fear, tempted by glory, and weary of chaos. And that is why it matters, because it reminds us that the fate of a republic, any republic, rests not in monuments or titles, but in habits, in how we speak, how we listen, how we disagree, and how we respond when our institutions falter. As we close this story, perhaps the most important truth is this: the Roman Republic was not a failure. It was a beginning, a long, imperfect, extraordinary experiment in what it means to govern together. Its memory remains not just in marble ruins or ancient texts, but in every quiet effort to build a just society, in every resistance to tyranny, in every voice that speaks not for power, but for the common good. And so tonight, as this tale fades into the gentle silence of sleep, may we not only remember what was lost, but also what might still be found. The Republic is gone, yes, but the idea of it, that delicate balance of freedom, responsibility, and shared purpose, still lives, waiting in the quiet corners of our conscience, ready to rise again wherever people choose it. And so, that brings us to the end of this quiet journey through the slow decline of the Roman Republic. Before we drift into the next chapter of forgotten history, if you're still here, gently listening in the dark, would you consider leaving a like and perhaps subscribing to this channel? It helps us keep these sleepy stories coming, one slow tale at a time. Now, let's stay still, keep the volume low, and continue our peaceful journey through time. Next up, a soft and silent story from the world of myths, masks, and marble steps. The history of ancient Greek theaters. Let us begin. Long before cinema, before television, before the hush of a darkened theater and the flicker of a screen, there were voices echoing under the open skies of ancient Greece. Theaters, vast, curved, carved into the sides of hills, welcomed audiences not into illusion, but into something closer to ritual. There were no curtains, no special effects, no artificial light. And yet in those open spaces, under the sun or the stars, entire cities would gather to watch, to listen, and to feel. The story of ancient Greek theaters is not just about architecture or performance. It is about the soul of a civilization that believed storytelling was a sacred act. The origins of theater in Greece are deeply tied to religion, specifically to the worship of Dionysus, the god of wine, fertility, and transformation. In early times, followers of Dionysus held festivals in his honor, festivals filled with music, dance, and ecstatic celebration. Over time, these gatherings evolved. The songs, or dithyrambs, sung by choruses in circular formations, began to include dialogue. Narratives began to form. A single voice stepped out from the chorus and became a character. And with that small step, drama was born. The earliest recorded playwright to make the shift was Thespis, in the 6th century BCE. He is said to have introduced the first actor, separate from the chorus, creating the possibility of dialogue and dramatic tension. This innovation laid the foundation for all Western theater. Even today, the word thespian refers to actors in his honor. The theater became a central part of Athenian civic life during the 5th century BCE, the Golden Age of Athens. Under the leadership of figures like Pericles, the city invested in grand festivals known as the Dionysia. These were not mere entertainments. They were competitions of art, funded by wealthy citizens as a form of public service, and attended by thousands. The Theater of Dionysus, located on the southern slope of the Acropolis, was the heart of this tradition. Its early form was simple, wooden benches and a circular dancing floor called the orchestra. But over time, it evolved into a monumental stone structure that could seat up to 17,000 spectators. The design of Greek theaters followed a consistent pattern. They were built into natural hillsides, allowing for a steep, tiered seating area called the theatron, which means viewing place. At the base was the orchestra, where the chorus would sing and dance. Behind that stood the skene, a building used for backdrops and entrances. The acoustics were extraordinary. Even in the farthest seats, a whisper on stage could be heard clearly. The Greeks had no microphones, no amplifiers, just geometry, wind, and careful attention to space. The performances themselves were powerful, stylized, and deeply symbolic. Actors wore masks with exaggerated features, allowing audiences to identify characters from a distance. These masks also helped amplify voices, with their hollow mouths serving as rudimentary sound chambers. Costumes were elaborate, robes and platform shoes transforming mortal men into gods, kings, and heroes. The plays were not random stories. They were drawn from myth, from shared memory, from the moral struggles of gods and men. Tragedy, comedy, and satyr plays formed the three genres of classical Greek drama. Tragedies explored the weight of fate, the fall of the mighty, the price of pride. Comedies often mocked politicians, social norms, and even the gods themselves, offering relief through laughter. Satyr plays, performed between tragedies, were bawdy and wild, filled with music and mischief, reminding the audience not to take everything too seriously. The playwrights of the Golden Age, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, and Aristophanes, were not mere entertainers. They were philosophers, critics, and visionaries. Aeschylus expanded the number of actors and introduced complex narratives. Sophocles gave us characters like Oedipus and Antigone, whose moral dilemmas still resonate. Euripides brought psychological depth and questioned divine justice. Aristophanes, the master of comedy, satirized war, politics, and even Socrates. Their works were deeply engaged with the issues of the time: war, justice, gender, the nature of the divine. Watching a play in Athens was not a passive act. It was a civic duty, a shared examination of what it meant to live well, to govern wisely, to die with dignity. Attendance was encouraged, and even the poor were given stipends to attend. The theater was not separate from politics or religion. It was woven into the very structure of the police. The city watched itself on stage, its triumphs, its failures, its fears, and its hopes. And through that shared reflection, it sought catharsis, not just emotional release, but purification. The idea was that by witnessing intense drama, by seeing the consequences of human folly, or the demands of justice, the audience would leave better, wiser, more attuned to the fragile balance between order and chaos. As the sun set over the marble steps and the final lines were spoken, the crowd would rise, not to applause as we know it today, but to the hum of shared understanding. They had not simply watched a play. They had participated in something sacred. As the classical age of Greece unfolded, the theater became not only a place of performance, but a reflection of the evolving values and identity of the Greek world. It was not static. Like the city-states themselves, it adapted, expanded, and experimented. The early wooden structures of Athens gave way to permanent stone theaters, not just in Attica, but throughout the Hellenic world. Wherever Greek culture spread, through colonization, conquest, or trade, so too did the theater, From the Aegean Islands to the coast of Asia Minor, from Sicily to North Africa, the signature curve of the Greek theatron emerged, nestled into hillsides, always open to the sky. These theaters were not merely architectural feats. They were civic symbols. Building a theater was a statement that the city valued art, valued public discourse, valued the spiritual and emotional growth of its people. Each theater was slightly different in its proportions, its materials, and its setting, but they all followed the same general design. The tiered seating of the theatron, the circular orchestra where the chorus moved in rhythmic unity, and the skene, where actors emerged in masks and robes to bring myth and morality to life. The skene itself evolved over time. At first it was a simple wooden structure, but as plays grew more complex, the skene became more elaborate, sometimes with multiple levels, painted backdrops, and mechanical devices. Innovations like the mechani, a crane that could lift an actor into the air, allowed gods to appear suddenly above the stage, giving rise to the term deus ex machina, or god from the machine. Other devices, like the ekiklima, a wheeled platform, allowed scenes of violence, often kept off stage, to be revealed dramatically to the audience. And yet, despite these tools, Greek theater remained minimalist. There were no scene changes in the modern sense, no lighting effects, no complex sets. The storytelling relied on the voice, the mask, the movement, and the words. It demanded attention, imagination, and reflection. This simplicity was intentional. The Greeks understood that too much spectacle could distract from the substance. The goal was not to overwhelm the senses, but to stir the soul. The relationship between audience and performance was central. Greek citizens did not sit in silent awe. They reacted, they responded. At times, laughter rippled through the rows. At others, a hush fell as the full weight of tragedy settled over the crowd. In a society built on shared responsibility, of voting, of serving in juries, of debating in the agora, theater was another form of collective engagement. It was a mirror, a question, a lesson, and it did not shy away from difficult topics. Tragedies like Medea forced the audience to confront betrayal, revenge, and exile. Comedies like Lysistrata dared to imagine women ending war through a strike on intimacy. Playwrights walked a fine line, challenging norms while honoring tradition. They were both critics and contributors to the civic order. The festivals that featured these plays were grand, multi-day events. The city Dionysia in Athens lasted for several days and included processions, sacrifices, and competitions. Playwrights would submit a trilogy of tragedies followed by a satyr play, all performed on the same day. Judges selected winners, and fame, if not fortune, awaited those who impressed. But participation extended beyond the artists. Rich citizens were expected to sponsor the chorus, paying for rehearsals, costumes, and training. This choregia was a form of liturgy, a public duty that brought prestige and fulfilled civic obligation. It was not charity, it was identity. And for those who sat in the seats of the theatron, whether near the stage or high in the marble stands, the experience was more than entertainment. It was a kind of democratic ritual. The theater allowed the city to speak to itself, to ask who it was, what it valued, what it feared. As Athens rose in power and influence, its theaters mirrored the tensions of that rise. Pride and hubris, themes central to many tragedies, were not abstract concerns. They were warnings. The characters who fell from grace did so because they lost sight of balance, of proportion, of humility. These were not just stories about mythic kings. They were veiled reflections on generals, politicians, and the people themselves. When Athens went to war with Sparta in the long and brutal Peloponnesian War, the theater did not turn away. It engaged. Euripides, in particular, wrote plays that questioned the justice of war, the suffering of women and children, the meaning of mercy. His Trojan Women, performed in the shadow of real conflict, portrayed the aftermath of conquest, not with glory, but with grief. And audiences watched, knowing that the distance between myth and reality was thinner than it appeared. Even in times of uncertainty, the theater remained. Fires may have swept through cities, tyrants may have risen and fallen, but the people continued to gather, to sit in curved stone rows, to listen as ancient words filled the air once more. There was something sacred in that act, a kind of collective breathing, a return to origin. And as night fell over the hills and torches flickered in the wind, the stories began again, whispers from the past, kept alive not by monuments, but by memory. As the influence of ancient Greece spread through trade, colonization, and conquest, so too did its ideas, its language, and its institutions. And among those enduring legacies, none were more visible than its theater. Greek theaters were not confined to Athens, or even the Greek mainland. They were constructed in coastal cities of Asia Minor, on the islands of the Aegean, in Sicily, in southern Italy, and across the shores of the Mediterranean, where Greek settlers and culture took root. Each new city that embraced Greek identity often raised a theater not merely as a venue for entertainment, but as a civic declaration. It was an architectural promise, a promise that the spoken word, poetic form, and public storytelling still held value. These theaters followed the same essential model, carved into hillsides, shaped in sweeping semicircles, open to the scout, but they also adapted to their environments. The theater at Epidaurus, for instance, built in the 4th century BCE, remains one of the most stunning examples of ancient acoustic design. Even from the top row of its 14,000 seats, a whisper from the stage can still be heard clearly. It was not only a marvel of engineering, but a place where human voice met natural landscape in a seamless harmony of purpose and presence. Yet it was not just architecture that spread. The content of the theater, the structure of plays, and the role of performance began to influence neighboring cultures, none more profoundly than the rising power of Rome. By the time the Romans began expanding into the Greek world during the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, they encountered a civilization rich with artistic, philosophical, and theatrical traditions. The Romans, pragmatic but deeply admiring of Greek culture, began to borrow, adapt, and eventually integrate Greek theater into their own growing empire. The earliest Roman playwrights, like Livius Andronicus and Plautus, translated and reimagined Greek plays for Latin-speaking audiences. They preserved the structure, prologue, chorus, episodic scenes, but infused the content with Roman values, humor, and political nuance. Comedy found a particularly receptive audience in Rome, where plays often mocked local figures, domestic conflicts, and the absurdities of daily life. The characters were familiar types: the cunning slave, the boastful soldier, the miserly father, the rebellious child. While tragedy continued to exist, it was comedy, fast-paced, farcical, and highly physical, that captured the Roman spirit. Over time, Roman theaters began to diverge from the Greek model. Instead of relying on natural hillsides, Roman engineers constructed freestanding theaters using concrete, allowing them to be built in any location, regardless of terrain. These theaters featured higher stages, elaborate backstage structures, and even awnings to protect audiences from the sun. The orchestra, once reserved for the chorus, became a seating area for elite spectators. The Theater of Pompey, completed in 55 BCE, was the first permanent stone theater in Rome. Its construction was controversial. Roman tradition had long resisted permanent theaters, associating them with Greek luxury and moral decay. But Pompey, ever the political strategist, attached a temple to Venus at the top of the seating area, framing the theater as a place of worship rather than idle entertainment. The structure could seat over 10,000 people, and its influence would stretch across the empire for centuries. As the Republic gave way to the Roman Empire, the function of theater shifted again. While plays continued to be performed, new forms of mass entertainment began to dominate: gladiatorial games, chariot races, and public executions. These spectacles, held in vast amphitheaters like the Colosseum, offered a more visceral, immediate thrill. Theater, with its layers of symbolism, moral inquiry, and poetic dialogue, could not always compete with the roar of blood and sand. Still, the Roman stage survived. Playwrights like Seneca wrote dark, introspective tragedies, often performed not for public crowds but in private settings among elites. The comedies of Plautus and Terence continued to be studied and performed. And the physical theaters themselves, dozens of them from Gaul to Syria, from North Africa to the British Isles, stood as monuments to a tradition inherited from Greece, but shaped by Rome's vast ambition. These Roman theaters often served as cultural outposts, bringing Romanized Greek drama to newly conquered lands, and helping to bind the empire not just through military might, but through shared narrative and language. In every province, the theater became a symbol of civilization, a space where Roman citizens and local inhabitants alike could gather, laugh, grieve, and reflect. The Greek spirit of theater, though transformed, endured. It was no longer just a religious festival or a civic duty. It was now an imperial tradition, a sign of Roman order, a mark of urban status. But still, somewhere in those performances, in the echo of iambic verse, in the flick of a mask, in the rising hush before a line was delivered, there remained a trace of that older world, where men and women once sat beneath the open sky, wondering what it meant to be mortal, to be just, to be human. The theater, though altered, continued to ask the same questions, quietly, persistently, eternally. As the Roman Empire entered its long period of decline, the fate of the theater followed a quieter, parallel descent. Once a thriving centerpiece of civic life and cultural expression, the theaters of the ancient world began to fall silent, not in dramatic collapse, but through the slow erosion of purpose. Political instability, economic hardship, and shifting cultural priorities all contributed to the gradual closing of the curtain. In the later centuries of the empire, performances became less frequent, and the plays themselves lost some of their former depth. Public spectacles increasingly overshadowed thoughtful storytelling. Gladiatorial combat, mock sea battles, and animal hunts captured the imagination of crowds now accustomed to grandeur and violence. The theater, with its language and masks and moral dilemmas, felt distant in a world craving spectacle and distraction. And yet, the buildings remained. Theaters, those sweeping stone crescents carved into hillsides or raised by Roman architects, did not vanish overnight. Some were repurposed. In many cities, they became marketplaces, military camps, or places of assembly. In others, they were simply abandoned, their marble steps worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain. Moss grew between the stones, grass crept into the orchestra. Birds nested where once actors declaimed verses about gods and kings. But the structure endured, a silent testament to a different time. As Christianity spread across the empire and eventually became the state religion, the theater's role in society changed dramatically. Early Christian leaders often viewed classical theater with suspicion. The content of many plays, mythological, pagan, and filled with moral ambiguity, clashed with the new spiritual and ethical priorities of the church. Moreover, the masks, costumes, and performative rituals of ancient drama were sometimes associated with idolatry, immorality, or vanity. In response, many performances were suppressed. Theaters fell further into disuse, their once sacred festivals forgotten or forbidden. But even as public theater declined, the impulse to dramatize, to perform, to embody story did not disappear. It retreated into churches, into monasteries, into oral tradition. In the early medieval period, storytelling survived in simpler forms: traveling minstrels, religious pageants, and folk dramas that combined local legend with moral instruction. In cathedral towns, priests began to incorporate dramatic elements into liturgy. These were not plays in the classical sense. They were short enactments of biblical events designed to teach and inspire. Performed in Latin, often by clergy, they focused on key moments: the Nativity, the Passion, the Resurrection. From these humble beginnings emerged a new kind of theater, rooted not in Dionysian celebration, but in Christian devotion. These liturgical dramas grew over time, moving from the altar to the churchyard, from Latin to vernacular language, from clergy to lay performers. Mystery plays, miracle plays, and morality plays emerged, each one a thread in the complex tapestry of medieval performance. And though they bore little resemblance to the tragedies of Euripides or the comedies of Aristophanes, they carried something similar at their core: the desire to use story as a way to understand the world. Meanwhile, in forgotten corners of Europe, copies of ancient plays survived. Monks preserved manuscripts and scriptoria, transcribing the works of Sophocles, Euripides, and Seneca by candlelight. These texts, though unread by most, remained as quiet seeds waiting for a more receptive soil. The Renaissance would eventually bring that soil. But for now, in the twilight centuries of the Roman world and the dawn of Christendom, the Greek and Roman theater slipped into memory. Reduced to ruins, faintly remembered, sometimes feared, sometimes admired. In the East, the Byzantine Empire maintained its own relationship with theater. While classical performance largely disappeared, forms of pantomime and spectacle continued. These were more visual than verbal, more movement than script. but they preserved the stage as a place of attention, of performance, of human expression. In the West, centuries passed with no new tragedies written, no new comedies staged in marble amphitheaters. The structures crumbled, cities fell, empires fractured, but the human need to gather, to witness, to reflect together through performance, this did not die, it went underground. It wore new clothes, it spoke a new language, but it waited. The memory of ancient theater, its shape, its scale, its spirit, rested beneath layers of history. It remained in the roundness of village squares, in the rhythm of public storytelling, in the echo of forgotten verses drifting through monastic halls. The theater had once been central to civic life. Now it lived in whispers, but not forever. The silence would not last. In time, the past would be remembered, the texts rediscovered, and the ruins reborn. But for now, the ancient theaters of Greece and Rome slept beneath the sun and stars, empty but not forgotten. For centuries, the once lively theaters of Greece and Rome stood in silence. The marble steps that had echoed with poetic verse and the shuffle of thousands of sandaled feet lay quiet, touched only by wind, rain, and the slow crawl of time. Moss crept across the stone. In some places, farmers grazed animals, where actors once played gods. In others, stones were taken from the ruins, repurposed into walls and roads, unknowing that they had once held stories. But memory, though faded, is rarely erased. It waits. And in the hills and libraries of Italy, in the quiet shadows of monasteries, memory began to stir. The 15th century marked the dawn of the Renaissance, a word that means rebirth. It was not a single moment, but a gradual awakening, a turning back toward the classical world, not to repeat it, but to understand it, to learn from it, to bring its beauty forward into a new age. And among the treasures recovered were the works of the ancient playwrights. In dusty manuscripts, tucked between religious texts and philosophical treatises, lay the tragedies of Sophocles, the comedies of Aristophanes, and the essays of Aristotle, who, in his Poetics, had once tried to define the very nature of drama itself. These texts were rediscovered, translated, debated, and with them came a renewed interest in the theater, not only as a means of entertainment, but as a noble art, a tool for exploring humanity. Across Italy, scholars and artists began to study ancient theater with fresh eyes. Architects examined the ruins of Roman theaters, not with indifference, but with wonder. They measured the curves of the cavea, the width of the orchestra, the placement of the stage. The design was no longer seen as primitive, but brilliant. The acoustics, the proportions, the harmonious balance between structure and environment, these were not accidents. They were achievements, and they inspired new visions. In cities like Florence, Rome, and Venice, theater returned. At first, performances were held in palace courtyards, in church squares, in academic halls. They were small, intimate, often written in Latin, blending medieval forms with classical influence. But soon, the desire to build grew. Theaters began to emerge, not just as stages, but as architectural homages to the past. In 1585, the Teatro Olimpico opened in Vicenza. Designed by Andrea Palladio and completed by his student Vincenzo Scamozzi, it was the first permanent indoor theater of the Renaissance. Its design was inspired directly by Roman theaters, with tiered seating, a grand scanae frons, and most famously, a fixed perspective stage that created the illusion of a street receding into the distance. This was not mere nostalgia, it was a rebirth, a reimagining of ancient ideals using modern techniques. In Ferrara, Florence, and later in England, France, and Spain, playwrights took inspiration from the past. They read Aristotle's theories on tragedy, studied the structure of Greek plays, and sought to revive not just the form, but the purpose of theater, to provoke thought, to move the soul, to refine the moral sense. Drama became an academic pursuit, a civic project, a spiritual reflection. In universities, students performed Latin comedies and tragedies. In royal courts, plays were commissioned to celebrate births, marriages, and political victories. Public theaters followed, and though their designs varied, from the open-air globe of London to the indoor theaters of Italy, their soul traced back to those stone steps beneath the Athenian sky. The Renaissance also brought with it a new kind of audience, no longer purely religious or aristocratic, the theater became increasingly accessible to merchants, craftsmen, and townspeople. Playwrights began to write not only for scholars, but for the streetwise, the skeptical, the romantic, the restless. The voices of the people re-entered the theater, not through ancient masks, but through new stories told in living languages. And yet, the ghosts of the Greeks lingered. You could hear them in the themes of honor, fate, and hubris. You could feel them in the chorus-like speeches, in the rise and fall of tragic heroes, in the questions whispered through soliloquies about right, wrong, power, and conscience. Even in distant lands, the echo of Greek theater was clear. In England, Shakespeare built his tragedies on the foundation laid by Aeschylus and Sophocles, even if he never read them directly. His flawed heroes, his 5-act structures, his meditations on destiny and downfall, all bore the imprint of ancient roots, reshaped for a new world. The Renaissance did not resurrect Greek theater exactly as it had been. It could not. The world had changed. The gods had changed. But it remembered enough. It remembered the power of the stage. The stillness before a line, the breath shared between actor and audience, the moment when myth, emotion, and truth converged beneath a sky that had seen it all before. And so, across Europe, the theater rose again, not in imitation, but in homage. A living bridge between the marble past and the flickering present, between the silence of ruins and the rising voice of a people rediscovering what it meant to gather, to watch, and to be changed. As the centuries unfolded beyond the Renaissance, the theater continued to evolve. It adapted to new languages, new cultures, new audiences, and new technologies. And yet, in all its transformations, it never fully left behind the quiet, powerful shadow of its origin. The open-air theaters of ancient Greece, where voices once echoed beneath blue skies and stars. In the modern age, that legacy lives on, not just in ruins or museums, but in the very structure of storytelling, the shape of auditoriums, and the questions that drama dares to ask. The 19th and 20th centuries saw an explosion of theatrical movements across Europe and beyond. Realism, symbolism, absurdism, expressionism, each style pushing the boundaries of what theater could be. And yet, even the most experimental forms still carried within them the DNA of the ancient stage. The idea that theater could be a forum for ideas, a mirror for society, a ritual for community, that idea was born in Athens. It persisted through Shakespeare, through Molière, through Ibsen and Chekhov, and into Brecht, Beckett, and beyond. Consider the proscenium arch, the fourth wall, the raised stage. These are not just conveniences of architecture. They are inherited choices, descended from centuries of performance, shaped in part by the semicircles of Greek theaters, and the relationship between performer and spectator first established there. Even when modern directors reject those forms, when they break the fourth wall or rearrange the audience in circles or thrusts, they are still in conversation with a tradition that began long ago, where theater was not a separate spectacle, but a shared human space. In education, too, the Greek influence is deep. The study of drama in universities often begins with Greek tragedy, not simply as literature, but as a foundation for understanding structure, character, and emotional arc. Students analyze the concept of catharsis, the role of the chorus, the unities of time, place, and action. They rehearse monologues once performed in togas, read aloud lines first spoken in marble theaters more than 2 millennia ago. These are not empty exercises. They are bridges. They connect us to a time when drama was more than entertainment, when it was how a city spoke to itself, how a people asked who they were. And even outside the classroom, in the realm of public discourse, echoes of Greek drama remain. Political speeches take the cadence of tragic appeals. Courtroom arguments unfold with dramatic arc. Media narratives, constructed as conflicts of heroes and villains, draw from the same primal storytelling that once filled the theater of Dionysus. Today, outdoor theaters built in the classical style continue to host plays, operas, and concerts. Epidaurus still welcomes visitors each summer, its ancient stones alive once more with music and voice. Audiences gather not just for the story, but for the experience, the feeling of sitting where others sat thousands of years ago, watching stories unfold beneath the same sky. In cities around the world, replicas and restorations of Greek theaters serve as venues for festivals, community events, and educational programs. These are not museums of nostalgia. They are living spaces. They prove that even in an age of screens and sound design, of digital effects and endless scrolling, there is still something powerful in the simplicity of voice, breath, and presence. The ancient Greeks believed that theater could reveal the truth of human nature, that through watching another's triumph or downfall, we might learn something about ourselves. That belief endures. It lives in every playwright who takes a risk, in every actor who steps onto a bare stage with nothing but words and will, in every audience that sits in silence, waiting for the first line. It lives in the belief that performance matters, that it can move, question, disturb, heal. Even the structure of our modern dramas, the arcs, the climaxes, the reversals, the recognition moments, are rooted in the tragedies of Athens. Oedipus discovers who he is. Antigone defies the state for moral law. Medea chooses revenge at great cost. These are not just characters, they are archetypes, still present in novels, films, and television dramas today. And beyond the scripts and stages, the deeper spirit of Greek theater endures. The idea that art is not escape, but encounter, that to tell a story is to offer a mirror, that even in an age of noise, there is wisdom in pausing, gathering, and listening together. And so the legacy of Greek theater is not just historical, it is living. It is in the shape of our stages, in the syllables of our sentences, in the silence between lines. It whispers to us, not in ancient Greek, but in the language of shared emotion, of conflict, of connection. It reminds us that to perform is human, to watch is to witness, and to gather, even in the dark, to hear the echo of a voice. We do that not because it is old, but because it still matters. The theater was never just about the past. It was and is a rehearsal for the present. And now, as we reach the quiet conclusion of this long journey, we pause to look back, not only across centuries, but across stages, scripts, voices, and silences. The history of ancient Greek theaters is not merely the story of marble and myth. It is a story of how humans gather to understand themselves. It begins with a hillside in Athens, where men sang hymns to Dionysus in a circle, their voices rising into the open air. From that sacred chant, something extraordinary grew. A single voice stepped forward. A character was born. A dialogue began. And with that moment, humanity created a new kind of space, one not of stone or soil, but of shared awareness. The theater became a place where the internal became external, where hidden feelings took form, where fear, grief, love, and justice could be shaped into sound. It was never just about the play. It was about reflection, about connection, about the invisible threads that link one person's story to another's. Through the rise of the Athenian polis, the Greek theater flourished, its tragedies confronting the weight of fate and hubris, its comedies offering laughter in the face of absurdity. The great amphitheaters of Epidaurus and Delphi, of Syracuse and Ephesus, were carved into the world not as monuments to glory, but as vessels for voice. The architecture served the idea. The sound traveled not just through air but through time. And even as empires shifted, when Rome absorbed Greece, when the Republic became the empire, when Latin replaced Greek on many stages, the shape of the theater endured. Rome added grandeur, expanded infrastructure, and reshaped the form. But the soul of performance remained rooted in its Greek origins. Even in the decline of the Western Roman world, when public theaters fell quiet and new spiritual orders rose, the essence of performance hid within churches and monasteries, re-emerging slowly as liturgical drama, as passion plays and sacred pageants. The Renaissance rediscovered what had been hidden. Stone theaters were measured, texts translated, and the plays once thought lost were read again with reverence. Artists and architects did not seek to mimic the past, but to converse with it. They looked to the Greeks not for nostalgia, but for clarity, for form, balance, proportion, and purpose. The theater was reborn in new languages, in new cities, but with familiar questions. The Enlightenment brought critical thought. The Romantic era brought emotion. Modernism brought abstraction. And still, the ancient shapes persisted. The curved rose, the central stage, the chorus that becomes a conscience, the questions, who are we? What drives us? Where does justice live? Never changed. Even today, in an age of global screens and virtual platforms, the influence of Greek theater can be found everywhere. in films that mirror the structure of tragic arcs, in courtroom dramas that echo the moral complexity of Antigone, in political satire that would have pleased Aristophanes, in solo performances that channel the raw emotional weight of Medea or Orestes. The chorus lives on in the voices of a watching public. The mask remains in every role played for survival or society. The stage, whether under a proscenium or projected through pixels, is still sacred, not for worship, but for witnessing. Education continues to pass down the tools of Greek drama: structure, catharsis, character, theme. Students learn not just how to write a play, but why. Directors speak of unity, rhythm, space, all rooted in the ancient belief that performance must speak not only to the mind, but to the body and the breath. And the theaters themselves, the physical remains of Epidaurus, of the Dionysian slopes, of Roman conversions, remain standing. Visitors walk their steps, whisper to test the acoustics, sit where thousands once gathered. Not for spectacle alone, but for shared insight. These are not ruins. They are reminders of the power of voice, of the importance of gathering, of the simple truth that storytelling, when done with sincerity, binds communities across time. The history of ancient Greek theaters is not over. It continues in every rehearsal room, in every audience hush, in every gasp, laugh, or tear drawn from a performance. It continues in classrooms, in festivals, in outdoor summer nights under the stars. It continues in the quiet conviction that art matters, not because it entertains, but because it reveals. As you close your eyes tonight, imagine sitting among the rows of an ancient stone theater, the sky above, the earth beneath, the wind soft against your skin. A single voice begins to speak. A story unfolds, and you, like all who came before, lean in to listen. Not just to be told something, but to be reminded of who you are. The theater was born in the echo between hearts, and it still echoes now, patient, gentle, eternal. As the final scenes fade from the stone stage of memory, and as we walk once more through the curved shadows of the ancient theatron, we come to understand something both simple and profound: that the story of Greek theater is not merely one of actors and architecture, of festivals and philosophies. It is the story of what happens when human beings pause, come together, and dare to look at themselves. For though the masks have changed, and though the scripts have shifted languages, the essential purpose of theater remains untouched by time. It exists not only to entertain, but to reveal, to peel back the layers of everyday life and hold up a mirror, not only to society, but to the soul. This is what the Greeks understood, perhaps more clearly than we often do now. They knew that performance was not escape. It was not distraction. It was confrontation, wrapped in beauty, rhythm, and myth. A sacred space where gods could speak through men, and where men could wrestle with the weight of gods. In the early spring, as the city of Athens prepared for the festival of Dionysus, citizens gathered in anticipation, not just for wine and revelry, but for something more vital. The playwrights had spent the winter writing. The actors had trained. The chorus had rehearsed the melodies. And when the festival began, the whole city, regardless of class, age, or wealth, turned its gaze toward the stage. It was there that questions were asked, deep, troubling questions that might not be answered, but needed to be spoken. What is justice? Can fate be outrun? What price does vengeance carry? Is loyalty stronger than law? Is love stronger than reason? Even now, centuries later, we sit before new stages, watching new actors breathe new life into old dilemmas. And still, those questions remain. The context changes, the setting updates, but the human heart does not. That is why the structure of Greek tragedy continues to inform modern storytelling. It is why screenwriters study the arc of Oedipus, why philosophers return to the silence of Antigone, why comedians still borrow from Aristophanes' biting satire. The Greeks built more than stone theaters. They built narrative frameworks, emotional blueprints, and philosophical invitations that continue to guide the way we explore meaning through art. Think of the amphitheater, not only as a place, but as a shape of thought, a shared space, open to the sky, where no one is hidden, where sound travels, where the performer faces the many. That openness is the essence of democracy. It is the architecture of visibility, and when a society gathers to hear a single voice, It is not only listening, it is consenting to be changed. We live now in a world saturated with sound, surrounded by performance. Every device in our pocket can show us 1,000 stories in a moment. But perhaps this makes the lesson of the ancient theater even more valuable. It asks us to slow down, to sit together, to watch one story at a time, to feel its weight, to reflect on its truth, and to leave not with noise in our heads, but with questions in our hearts. For the Greeks, the theater was an ethical laboratory. It was where moral failure could be studied without destruction, where the consequences of pride, betrayal, or mercy could be witnessed without cost to the viewer. It was a way of rehearsing life's hardest choices before they arrived in real form. It trained the citizen not just to feel, but to think. And perhaps that is the quiet legacy that matters most. Today, when we teach children about the Greeks, we often begin with gods and myths. We speak of temples and warriors, of philosophers and geometry. But somewhere in that lesson, there must also be a story of the theater, of the hill where strangers sat side by side, where actors donned masks not to hide but to reveal, where words rose into the sky like prayers, raw, imperfect, brave. That story still matters, because every time we step into a darkened hall and feel the hush before a performance begins, we are part of it. Every time a character speaks and we recognize ourselves in their sorrow or joy, we carry it forward. The history of ancient Greek theater is not locked in the past. It moves, breathes, and waits. In classrooms, in rehearsal rooms, in the hushed moments before a curtain rises, in the silence after a final line, and in you, the listener, the watcher, the dreamer, you carry the echoes now. The stone theaters may stand still, but their voices travel. And if you are quiet enough, if the noise of the world fades and you lean into the story, you might still hear them. A whisper from the hills, a footstep on ancient stage boards, a chorus calling out into the night, not for applause but for understanding. For in the end, the theater is not about actors or playwrights or kings. It is about us, all of us, sitting together in the dark, listening, learning, and remembering how to be human. As the echoes of ancient Greek theaters ripple further into the modern world, we begin to see their impact not only on the art of performance, but on the very ways we think, feel, and form ourselves as individuals and as societies. The theater, born in ritual and shaped by civic life, has always been more than a stage. It is a space where the human mind learns to see itself. In the ancient world, Greek tragedy was not entertainment in the sense we know it today. It was a public mirror held up before the people by those brave enough to ask the hardest questions. Tragedy did not offer easy answers. It asked instead that the audience sit with complexity, dwell in discomfort, and see the nobility in confronting the limits of knowledge, choice, and fate. It was a practice of collective introspection, and in this way, it became one of the earliest tools of what we might now call psychology. Long before Freud or Jung, the Greek dramatists explored repression, guilt, memory, moral conflict, and identity. They did so not through theory, but through story. In Oedipus Rex, we witness a man unravel not because he is evil or foolish, but because he seeks the truth. His downfall is tragic precisely because it is born of a noble intention. In Electra, we see the long shadow of grief and vengeance, emotions that twist the soul even as they strive for justice. In the Bacchae, the danger of denying one's instinctual self is laid bare in a terrifying, ecstatic spiral. These were not just stories, they were emotional maps, laid out on stage in full view of the police. The ancient Greeks knew that when the heart is stirred, the mind opens. And so, theater became a place of transformation, not only for the actors, who embodied pain and divinity through masks and verse, but for the spectators, who underwent catharsis, a word rooted in Greek, meaning cleansing or purification. This was not metaphorical, it was visceral. The audience wept not just for the characters, but for themselves, for their neighbor, for the city. They left not only entertained, but changed. This idea has never fully left us. Today, psychologists still study drama therapy, a practice where role-play and storytelling help people process trauma, explore emotions, and step into new perspectives. Much of this work draws from the original Greek insight, that through performance, one can access deeper truths. The theater remains a space where individuals can encounter shadows safely, where they can see conflict externalized and learn to name it. Politics, too, retains its roots in theater. In Athens, democratic debate and tragic drama evolved side by side. Both depended on persuasion, voice, character, and spectacle. Both asked the people to gather, to listen, to judge. Even now, political theater is not a metaphor, it is a fact. Campaigns are staged, speeches are performed, and while this can invite manipulation, it also reveals the continuing importance of narrative in shaping public life. Leaders are expected not just to govern, but to tell stories about who we are, where we've been, and where we might go. When done well, it inspires. When done poorly, it deceives. But in either case, the tools are theatrical, and their lineage can be traced back to the chorus, the monologue, the mask. In modern identity, theater has also played a role in expansion and inclusion. Over time, as stages opened to more voices, the ancient model provided a flexible frame for new stories. Women, once excluded from Greek performance, became playwrights and protagonists. Marginalized communities used theater as a platform to claim space, speak truth, and reshape culture. Ancient drama inspired not only imitation, but innovation. Greek structure, with its elegant arc and thematic depth, proved strong enough to hold new voices, new stories, new forms of justice. And so, the Greek theater, though ancient, remains vividly alive, not in the preservation of its form, but in the transmission of its spirit. In the belief that performance matters, that public space matters, that memory, when shared, becomes wisdom. In small towns and major cities, in classrooms and festivals, in black box theaters and grand opera houses, people still gather, still listen, still feel, and behind every modern performance, somewhere faint and far off, you can almost hear the ghost of a chorus, speaking not in fear, not in glory, but in understanding. They do not demand applause. They ask only that we listen, that we think, that we carry forward the question, because that is what theater is. It is the art of the question, the sacred pause between action and response. And the Greek theater, above all, taught us how to ask better ones. Now, as we near the quiet conclusion of this long journey through the history of ancient Greek theaters, we find ourselves not just in the presence of history, but of something softer and more enduring, an idea that has traveled with us through time. It began in the hush before the chorus sang, in the rustle of tunics as crowds settled into stone benches, in the breath held before the first line was spoken. What the Greeks built, what they left behind, was not only an architectural marvel or a literary tradition. It was a way of being together, a way of creating space in which truth could be safely spoken, pain could be shared, laughter could rise, and questions could echo without needing immediate answers. In their theaters, they made room for contradiction, for mystery, for the kind of wisdom that doesn't always arrive neatly wrapped but comes slowly, through rhythm, through voice, through witnessing. Today, we are far removed from those ancient festivals. We no longer walk in robes toward the slopes of the Acropolis, no longer sit in sun-warmed stone semicircles, awaiting the fate of Orestes or the sorrow of Antigone. Our cities are louder, our distractions endless, but the impulse remains. We still gather. In theaters, in cinemas, around stages large and small. We still dim the lights and grow quiet together. We still lean forward when a character pauses, when their voice cracks, when their eyes reflect something we too have known but could never say aloud. In these moments, the spirit of Greek theater is not a relic. It is alive. It is not something we visit in museums, but something we carry in our imaginations, in our empathy, in the way we allow stories to change us. Every time we witness a performance and feel that subtle shift within, when we suddenly see someone else's experience as if it were our own, we are continuing what began so long ago. The Greeks called it catharsis, but it is also simply the act of remembering that we are human and that we do not feel alone, that we are not sealed in our own experience, but part of something larger, more ancient, and more tender. Theaters remind us of that. Their shape reflects it. Their silence invites it. Their voices make it known, and that is why they have survived. Even as empires collapsed, languages changed, and scripts were rewritten, the structure held. Not only the physical curve of the theatron, but the emotional arc of a story shared. That shape, the rise, the turn, the fall, the truth, is still how we understand our lives, In joy, in grief, in humor, in fear, we turn to stories, to name the unnameable, to soften the unbearable, to celebrate what is fleeting and precious. Ancient Greek theater gave us this gift, not perfection, not answers, but the courage to feel, the courage to look at life not with detachment, but with wonder. In those marble rows, people sat shoulder to shoulder with neighbors, strangers, rivals, friends. They looked toward the stage, but they also looked inward. And when the final line was spoken and the chorus fell still, they stood not just as audience members, but as witnesses to something shared, something sacred. That is the quiet power of theater. And it is why, even now, those old stones still matter. They remind us that our ancestors, though clothed in different fabric, shaped by different gods, spoke our language. They feared what we fear. They hoped as we hope. They laughed, they wept, they longed to understand what it means to be alive. They looked toward the stage not to forget themselves, but to find themselves. And in doing so, they built not just theaters, but bridges, across time, across silence, across the fragile distances between us. As the story comes to a close, perhaps you can imagine it one last time. The cool stone beneath you, the soft breeze through olive trees, the hush of 1,000 hearts, waiting in unison. The first sound, a voice, clear and steady, rising into the air. Carried not by speakers, but by memory, the story begins. The world holds still, and for a moment you are there. Not watching history, but becoming part of it. Carry that feeling with you, gently, into sleep, into morning, into whatever story comes next. And now, our story comes to a close. But before we move on to the next quiet chapter, if you're still with us, listening, breathing softly in the dark, may I ask for a gentle like and a peaceful subscription? It helps us bring more of these sleepy journeys to life. Now, let's stay just as still, just as quiet, as we continue our series of boring history for sleep and drift gently into the next story, the art of Japanese calligraphy through the ages. Let us begin. In the stillness of a quiet room, where brush meets paper and time seems to slow, there lies an ancient practice that transcends both language and line. Japanese calligraphy, known as shodo, the way of writing, is not merely the act of forming characters. It is the art of capturing spirit, a moment, a breath, a feeling translated into ink and stroke. To follow its story is not to read history in the traditional sense, but to feel it, like watching a ripple move across a pond or listening to the hush of wind moving through trees. The journey of Japanese calligraphy begins not in Japan, but in ancient China. Long before the islands of Japan developed their own system of writing, they were deeply influenced by the Chinese script, which arrived through cultural exchange in the 4th and 5th centuries. At the time, China had already developed a complex written language with thousands of characters, known as kanji. These characters were not only linguistic tools, but aesthetic objects, crafted with attention to structure, rhythm, and harmony. As Chinese culture spread across East Asia through diplomacy, religion, and trade, so too did its writing system. Japanese scholars, monks, and nobles encountered these Chinese characters and began to incorporate them into their own cultural fabric. With no indigenous writing system of their own, the Japanese initially used Chinese characters to represent both meaning and sound. But over time, they began to adapt the system. The result was not only the development of unique Japanese scripts, kana including hiragana and katakana, but also the emergence of a distinct calligraphic tradition. Early Japanese calligraphy was closely tied to the world of Buddhism. Monks played a central role in copying sutras, sacred texts that were believed to carry not only spiritual wisdom, but also merit. Writing these texts was an act of devotion. Each brushstroke was a meditation, a prayer made visible. Ink was ground by hand, brushes were held with quiet purpose, and the characters were written slowly, reverently. It was not just about legibility, it was about presence. This spiritual foundation gave Japanese calligraphy a depth that went beyond aesthetics. To write well was to be centered, balanced, calm. The influence of Zen Buddhism would later deepen this perspective. Zen, with its emphasis on impermanence, intuition, and simplicity, found a perfect partner in calligraphy. Zen monks would often write single characters, such as mu, meaning nothingness, with bold, expressive strokes. These were not perfect in the traditional sense. They were not symmetrical or refined. But they were alive, honest. They reflected the moment of their making, the energy of the body, the stillness of the mind. And that was the point. The act of writing became a form of self-discovery, a way to express inner clarity or chaos through the movement of the brush. Over time, calligraphy found its place in every corner of Japanese culture. In the imperial court, nobles practiced refined scripts, elegant and flowing, written on scrolls and poetry cards. These were often accompanied by seasonal references, natural imagery, or lines from classical Japanese literature. In the warrior class, samurai trained not only in swordsmanship, but also in calligraphy, as part of their cultivation of discipline and inner strength. For them, writing was a form of control, a quiet mastery that paralleled the stillness before a strike. In rural temples, monks continued to write sutras for both study and offering. In everyday households, people practiced writing as part of education, expression, and beauty. And through all of these expressions, calligraphy evolved. Different styles emerged, each with its own mood, rhythm, and intention. Kaisho, the standard script, is careful and precise, with clear separation between strokes. It is the foundation for learning, the beginning of all practice. Gyosho, the semi-cursive script, is looser, more fluid, like a stream flowing gently between banks. And Sosho, the cursive or grass script, is the most free. It dances, it breathes. It often seems unreadable to the untrained eye, but to the calligrapher, it is poetry in motion. These styles are not merely visual, they are emotional states, captured in ink. To choose a script is to choose a voice, a tone, a way of being, and this, perhaps, is the quiet magic of Japanese calligraphy. It is not performed on a stage, it makes no sound, it leaves no applause. But in its silence, it speaks volumes. It invites us to slow down, to observe, to appreciate the curve of a line, the weight of a dot, the pause between strokes. It teaches that beauty lies not in complexity, but in clarity, not in perfection, but in presence. The brush does not lie. It records each tremor, each hesitation, each breath. It is, in the end, a portrait of the one who holds it. And so, as we begin this exploration of Japanese calligraphy, we do not rush. We move slowly, like ink spreading across paper. We follow each line, each century, each hand that held the brush. And in doing so, we discover that the history of calligraphy is not just written on scrolls or taught in schools. It is alive in every moment of attention, every stroke of intention, every quiet act of meaning made visible. To truly understand the evolution of Japanese calligraphy is to explore not only its history, but its many distinct forms, each one a living reflection of the culture, emotions, and values of the people who practiced it. These styles are more than mere handwriting. They are voices rendered in ink, breathing through the movement of brush and hand, and each script carries its own rhythm, its own silence, and its own way of revealing the heart behind the line. The most basic, and perhaps the most foundational of these, is kaisho, the standard or block script. Developed in the early centuries of Chinese calligraphy and later adopted into Japanese practice, kaisho is deliberate. Each stroke is carefully placed, each line clearly separated, each character balanced like the beams of a quiet, stable house. For students and beginners, kaisho is the first doorway. It teaches not only technique, but patience. Writing in kaisho is like walking slowly across a narrow path. The mind must be steady, the breath even, the hand relaxed but focused. It is not only about form, it is about discipline. When written correctly, kaisho is not stiff. It has presence, structure, and a quiet dignity. The white spaces between the strokes mattered just as much as the lines themselves. This script was widely used in official documents, temple inscriptions, and educational texts. It was the script of clarity, of respect, of learning. But as calligraphers grew in confidence, they often moved into gyosho, the semi-cursive script. Here, the strokes begin to flow together. Movements are more fluid. Characters retain their structure but soften at the edges, like stones smoothed by water over time. Writing in gyosho is like listening to a quiet stream. It flows with intention, but also with freedom. The brush moves more quickly, transitions more smoothly between strokes, and allows for greater personal expression. This style became popular for personal letters, poetry, and more intimate writing. It allowed the writer's personality to emerge gently, like a fragrance in the air. A master calligrapher writing in gyosho does not simply write words, they sing them with ink. And then there is sosho, the grass script. This is the most abstract, the most intuitive, the most expressive. In sosho, characters are often unrecognizable to the untrained eye. Strokes are joined, exaggerated, or abbreviated. The brush dances freely, guided more by energy and emotion than by rules. Writing in sosho is like improvising music. It comes from the body, from the breath, from the moment. The calligrapher becomes one with the movement. There is no correction, no erasing. What appears on the paper is what exists in that instant. Sosho is not about precision, it is about presence. The boldness of the line, the speed of the stroke, the pressure of the brush, all tell a story that goes beyond the character itself. It is a direct reflection of the calligrapher's inner state. In this way, sosho is deeply connected to Zen. It asks for surrender, for truth, for letting go of perfection and trusting the gesture. But these styles are not isolated. A skilled calligrapher learns to move between them, to blend them, to choose the form that best suits the message. A single piece might begin in kaisho, shift into gyosho, and end in sosho, like a conversation that grows more intimate as it unfolds. This blending of styles mirrors the blending of time and thought. The writer becomes a bridge between tradition and spontaneity, a vessel for centuries of form, and a voice for the moment that is now. Beyond these three core styles, Japanese calligraphy also developed unique forms for different purposes. The kana scripts, hiragana and katakana, were developed to represent Japanese sounds more fluidly than kanji, and their arrival brought a new wave of calligraphic expression, particularly among court poets and aristocratic women. Hiragana, with its soft, looping curves, became the preferred script for classical poetry and emotional expression. It allowed for gentle rhythm, lyrical flow, and elegant simplicity. In the Heian period, women of the court used hiragana to compose personal diaries, letters, and poems, some of which are now considered masterpieces of Japanese literature. These calligraphic works were not only prized for their content, but for their visual beauty. A single word written in flowing hiragana on fine paper with delicate ink and fragrance could carry the depth of a whole season. Katakana, by contrast, emerged as a more angular and practical script, used initially by Buddhist monks to annotate Chinese texts and later adopted for foreign words, emphasis, and technical terms. It was a tool, precise and functional, but even it found its place in the art of calligraphy when handled with care. Over the centuries, Japanese calligraphers developed not only technical skill, but deep philosophical approaches to their work. Some focused on repetition, writing the same character hundreds, even thousands of times, not for perfection, but for understanding. Others focused on emptiness, the white space around the ink, known as ma, valued just as much as the marks themselves. To practice calligraphy was to practice being, and the more one studied, the more one realized that true mastery was not about control, but about release, letting the brush move, letting the heart speak, letting the moment become visible on the page. To trace the journey of Japanese calligraphy through the ages is to move gently through the very fabric of Japan's history, its dynasties, its philosophies, its changing roles of class and culture. Calligraphy, while always rooted in brush and ink, transformed with each era, shaped not only by aesthetics, but by the shifting currents of politics, religion, and society. It is a mirror held quietly to the spirit of each age. During the Heian period, from the late 8th to the 12th century, Japanese calligraphy began to develop its most distinct and refined character. This era, marked by peace and courtly elegance, was a time when beauty, subtlety, and poetic sensitivity were held in the highest regard. The imperial court in Kyoto became the center of artistic expression, and within its walls, calligraphy flourished, not as mere writing, but as a deeply personal form of emotional and spiritual release. In this environment, kana scripts, particularly hiragana, rose to prominence. Because kanji had long been associated with formal Chinese texts and male scholars, hiragana became a more intimate, lyrical form, often used by women to express feeling, thought, and memory. It was during this time that masterpieces such as The Tale of Genji and The Pillow Book were written by noblewomen whose calligraphy was praised as much as their prose. In Heian calligraphy, the line was everything. Flow was prized above clarity. A single continuous stroke might convey mood more deeply than any carefully drawn character. Scrolls from this period often read like rivers, words drifting with the soft curve of a brush, the ink fading gently at the end of a line, revealing not just narrative but presence. Paper, too, was a canvas of beauty. Colored, scented, or decorated with gold leaf and pressed flowers, it was chosen with care, matching the tone of the poem or the mood of the writer. A letter was not just a message, it was an offering. As the Heian era gave way to the Kamakura period, from the late 12th century to the early 14th, Japan experienced profound social and cultural shifts. Power moved from the imperial court to the emerging warrior class, the samurai, who brought with them new values: discipline, loyalty, simplicity, and the influence of Zen Buddhism. These values would come to shape calligraphy in deeply meaningful ways. Zen monks, seeking clarity and awakening, practiced calligraphy as a form of meditation. Their works were bold, raw, and unfiltered. A single character, written in swift, spontaneous motion, could express a whole teaching. This was not about refinement. It was about presence. The moment of creation became the message itself. Calligraphy was no longer confined to poetry and letters. It became spiritual practice. These bokuseki, or traces of ink, were often mounted in temples, hanging beside altars or scrolls, their faded characters holding the silence of centuries. Samurai, influenced by Zen, also embraced calligraphy. For them, it became part of their code, bushido. To master the brush was to reflect inner mastery. The same hand that wielded a sword must also know stillness. Many samurai practiced calligraphy daily, writing proverbs, poems, or Buddhist texts before battle, or as part of evening ritual. Their strokes were often strong and minimal, reflecting restraint and quiet power. During the Muromachi, and later the Edo period, from the 14th through 19th centuries, Japan saw both isolation and flourishing. The shogunate system stabilized society, and culture turned inward. Calligraphy continued to thrive, not only in temples and castles, but in towns and merchant homes. Schools of calligraphy were formalized, and great masters passed on styles, philosophies, and disciplines. Different styles became associated with different schools and regions. The Oye-ryu, used in governmental documents, favored clarity and strength. The Wyo style, rooted in earlier native traditions, emphasized softness and personal feeling. Meanwhile, among the merchant class, calligraphy became part of cultural refinement. Business letters were expected to be elegant. Poetry gatherings, or haikai, included the artful writing of verse on scrolls, often accompanied by paintings. The idea of the bunjin, the literati or cultured gentleman, grew in popularity. These scholar artists valued poetry, painting, and calligraphy equally, practicing them not for fame, but for cultivation of the self. In their hands, calligraphy was gentle, expressive, and poetic. Even the ink became meaningful. Thicker, darker strokes reflected boldness or sorrow. Lighter, diluted lines suggested reflection, distance, or fading memory. Tools were chosen with care. A softer brush, a more absorbent paper, a special inkstone carried for years. Everything mattered. By the end of the Edo period, calligraphy had spread across all layers of society. It was taught in schools, practiced in homes, revered in temples. It appeared in hanging scrolls, folding screens, fans, and personal letters. It was no longer reserved for monks or nobles. It belonged to the people, and yet, it never lost its sacred thread. In every brushstroke, the calligrapher's spirit remained visible. Whether written in a palace, a temple, or a modest village room, each piece was an encounter, a quiet exchange between the writer and the world. And that is how calligraphy endured, not by growing louder, but by growing deeper. As Japan entered the modern era, stepping cautiously yet resolutely into a world shaped by steam, steel, and global exchange, the art of calligraphy found itself at a quiet crossroads. The Meiji Restoration of the late 19th century brought with it sweeping transformations: political, technological, educational, and cultural. In an effort to modernize and match the industrial strength of the West, Japan adopted new systems of governance, restructured its institutions, and opened its doors to foreign influence after centuries of isolation. Among the many shifts, the written word itself was touched. Western calligraphy, Latin script, and modern printing methods began to flow into Japan's cities and schools. Typewriters replaced brushes in offices. Printed textbooks replaced handwritten scrolls in classrooms. A new emphasis on efficiency, legibility, and uniformity spread across the nation. The brush, once a daily companion, now sat quietly beside pens and pencils. And yet, calligraphy did not vanish. It bent, but did not break. It waited, adapting not by discarding its soul, but by finding new ways to speak in a changing world. In schools, calligraphy remained a required subject, shuji, taught not as art, but as handwriting. Students learned to form characters with balance and clarity, using brush and ink, guided by grid lines and repetition. Though the spiritual depth of Zen calligraphy was often absent in these lessons, the seeds of reverence were still sown. Children learned that to write was not merely to record, but to shape. That each stroke mattered, that patience and presence could live in the movement of ink. Outside the classroom, artists and scholars sought to preserve and evolve the artistic side of calligraphy. Exhibitions, journals, and cultural societies formed to support shodo, not as a fading relic of the past, but as a living art. Modern calligraphers experimented with form, integrating abstract composition, new materials, and influences from Western painting. This period saw the emergence of avant-garde calligraphy, where the traditional scripts were deconstructed, exaggerated, or reimagined into expressive gestures of movement and space. These works often blurred the boundary between writing and painting. Some pieces no longer sought to be read, but rather to be felt. The ink became breath, the paper became emotion, and the brushstroke became a singular moment of being, captured forever. This blending of East and West sparked dialogue rather than division. While traditionalists continued to preserve the classical forms, modernists embraced innovation, and both approaches found meaning. Museums began to display calligraphy beside contemporary art. International audiences started to recognize the elegance and depth of Japanese brushwork, even when they could not read a single character. In the post-war years, as Japan rebuilt and redefined itself once again, calligraphy found new resonance. Amid the rapid rise of technology, consumerism, and modern life, many turned back to old practices, not for nostalgia, but for grounding. The act of grinding ink on an inkstone, of laying brush to paper, of slowing the breath to meet the rhythm of line, these became quiet acts of resistance to the noise and speed of the modern world. Calligraphy workshops grew in popularity. Urban professionals took classes to find calm after long workdays. Artists explored calligraphy as a path not only to beauty, but to inner stillness. Exhibitions showcased bold new interpretations alongside ancient scrolls. And in this quiet resurgence, a truth emerged, that calligraphy, at its heart, was not about the past, it was about presence. In recent decades, as the digital age unfolded, bringing with it keyboards, touchscreens, and automated fonts, the role of handwriting shifted once again. Fewer people wrote letters by hand. Emails replaced ink. Messaging apps replaced paper notes. And yet, once again, calligraphy endured. On digital tablets, artists began to mimic brushstrokes with styluses. Apps were created to teach traditional forms. Videos of master calligraphers drawing single characters with focused breath and fluid motion began to circulate online, watched by millions across cultures. People from around the world, many who could not read Japanese, found themselves moved by the slow, deliberate stroke of a kanji character. They felt the weight of intention, the echo of silence, the invitation to pause. And in these moments, calligraphy transcended language. It became a shared human gesture, a reminder that in the age of infinite scrolling, there is still power in one slow line. Calligraphy found new homes in branding, in interior design, in modern fashion. It appeared on clothing, ceramics, and architecture. In yoga studios and meditation centers, a single character, Zen, Mu, Ai, might hang on a wall, quietly holding the room with its presence. But perhaps its most enduring place remains where it has always been, in the hands of those who practice it. Those who sit down, grind the ink, breathe once, and begin. Whether they follow strict classical form or move freely across the paper, Whether they write full poems or single words, they are part of a living tradition, a lineage of writers, monks, warriors, poets, and dreamers, stretching back more than 1,000 years. Through war and peace, simplicity and change, the art of Japanese calligraphy has endured not because it refused to change, but because it knew how to return, to quiet, to presence, to the sacred motion of brush meeting paper, again and again, a black line across white space, a moment made visible. As we come to the end of this quiet journey through the story of Japanese calligraphy, what lingers most is not just the evolution of characters or styles, but the stillness behind every stroke. This ancient art, passed down through dynasties, across temples, courts, and classrooms, is more than ink and brush. It is a conversation between the writer and the self, between silence and sound, between the past and the now. Calligraphy has always been shaped by the tension between structure and freedom. The writer begins with rules of form, proportion, balance, but ultimately surrenders to rhythm, breath, and expression. In every movement of the brush, something invisible is made visible. A thought, a pause, a feeling too quiet for speech. This is what gives Japanese calligraphy its enduring magic. The line is alive. The brush does not merely record, it reveals. The ink does not just cover, it speaks. In a single character, a whole state of being can be captured: calm, joy, doubt, resolve. Even in the simplest forms, the writer's presence lingers long after the ink dries. This is why, for centuries, masters have said that calligraphy reveals the soul. It is a mirror, honest, unfiltered, soft. In the act of writing, time slows. The world narrows to brush and breath. There is no multitasking, no distraction, no noise, only motion, only now. Whether the calligrapher is a monk in a mountain temple, a schoolchild copying characters after class, or a modern artist exploring ink on canvas, the practice connects them to something deeper, something older than words. It is a ritual of presence, of return. The materials themselves guide this intimacy. The brush, soft yet strong, responds to every nuance of pressure and angle. The ink, ground by hand, carries its own mood, sometimes dark and rich, other times soft and smoky. The paper, delicate yet sturdy, holds each mark like memory. Together, they form a trinity of attention. Nothing is rushed. Nothing is wasted. Even the mistakes, perhaps especially the mistakes, are embraced. A slip of the wrist, a broken line, a blot too dark. These are not flaws to be erased, but parts of the story. Just as in life, perfection is not the goal. Presence is, acceptance is. The beauty of Japanese calligraphy lies not in its complexity, but in its honesty. In a world where so much is edited, filtered, and rehearsed, this quiet art invites something different. It asks us to be as we are, to write as we feel, to meet the moment with courage and care. And through that, it becomes more than art. It becomes a way of being. Even as technology advances and digital tools multiply, the essence of calligraphy endures. It is not tied to a specific time or place. It can live on paper or on screen, on walls or in hearts. What matters is not the format, but the intention. The brush may one day be replaced, but the need to slow down, to express with care, to be seen and heard without speaking, that will remain. Across Japan, calligraphy continues to be practiced, studied, loved. In quiet corners of temples, in weekend workshops, in the hands of children learning their first strokes. And in each setting, the same thread runs through, the line between the visible and the invisible, drawn in ink. For those who practice it, calligraphy is not simply tradition, it is comfort. It is meditation. It is identity. In a rapidly changing world, it offers stillness. In a noisy world, it offers silence. In a fragmented world, it offers wholeness. This is why so many return to the brush, again and again. Because in its simplicity, there is depth. In its slowness, there is healing. In its repetition, there is renewal. Perhaps that is the real message hidden in the black ink and soft lines. That beauty is born in patience. That truth reveals itself not in loudness, but in quiet consistency. That even a single humble character, drawn with care, can carry centuries of wisdom. And maybe in this very moment, as you listen with eyes closed and mind softening, you too can feel it. the breath of calligraphy, passing through time to meet you here. Let it be your reminder that even in silence, there is meaning. Even in stillness, there is movement. Even in simplicity, there is depth. So rest now, gently. The stories have been told, the lines have been drawn, and the brush has returned to stillness. Though history may chart the movements of empires, shifts in aesthetic schools, and cultural tides, the true heart of Japanese calligraphy lives in smaller, quieter places, in the daily rituals of ordinary people, in the quiet hands of someone writing a poem for a loved one, in the letter carefully brushed by a grandparent to their grandchild, in the names inscribed by hand at a shrine for the new year. These moments, too small for textbooks, form the living thread of shodo. Each person who picks up a brush and grinds the ink becomes part of this quiet lineage. And while many today no longer use brushes in daily life, there is a deep respect that continues for the power and grace of the written word. In many homes across Japan, you can still find a calligraphy scroll hanging in the tokonoma, or alcove, a sacred space of simplicity that holds a single work of art, often paired with a flower arrangement or seasonal ornament. The scroll is chosen carefully, its words reflecting the time of year, the mood of the household, or the message the host wishes to convey to guests. It might display the word peace or harmony, or perhaps a line of seasonal poetry in flowing kana. Changing the scroll is an act of renewal. The home breathes with the rhythm of the seasons, and the calligraphy mirrors that breath. In temples, calligraphy remains central to spiritual practice. Monks write sacred texts not only to preserve teachings, but as a form of devotion. Each stroke is an offering. The ink, prepared with quiet intention, is not just pigment, it is presence. The act of writing becomes a meditation, one brushstroke, one breath, one moment of stillness in a world that spins quickly. Many pilgrims and visitors request handwritten talismans or blessings from temple priests, often receiving small slips of paper inscribed with characters meant to protect, guide, or heal. These characters are not mass-produced. They are brushed with care, each one slightly different, each one alive. The ink carries meaning, but so does the movement. The human hand imbues each symbol with care, memory, and moment. In schools, though much of modern life has shifted to pens and keyboards, calligraphy classes remain. Children still learn to hold the brush upright, to respect the tools, to write slowly. In these lessons, they are taught more than form. They are taught rhythm, humility, and care. The classroom is quiet when calligraphy is practiced. The scraping of the inkstone, the soft tapping of brush on paper, the gentle voice of a teacher correcting posture. These are sounds of focus and discipline. Each child's work is pinned to the wall, not for judgment, but to celebrate effort. The characters may not be perfect, but they are sincere. And that sincerity, even in childhood, is honored. In festivals and special occasions, calligraphy also finds a voice. During the new year, it is tradition to perform kakizome, the first writing of the year. On the second day of January, people of all ages gather to write their hopes, resolutions, or cherished words on fresh white paper. Some write with traditional tools, others with pens, but the spirit remains the same, to begin the year with clarity and intention. Schools often hold kakizome competitions, where students gather in gymnasiums, kneel on large sheets of paper, and write with sweeping brushes, their words bold and open. The characters might read dream, beginning, courage, or gratitude. Parents come to watch. Cameras click quietly. And though there are awards given, what matters most is the act of writing itself. The connection between thought and movement. The freshness of beginning again. In homes, some elderly Japanese continue to write daily, brushing poetry or phrases in notebooks, as a way to keep the mind sharp and the spirit calm. For them, the act is not for display, but for the self, a moment each day to return to something still and familiar. Their hands may tremble, their ink may blur, but in those lines is a lifetime of feeling, of learning, of being. In the modern world, some young people are rediscovering calligraphy as a form of personal expression. On social media, videos of calligraphy performances gain millions of views, artists painting characters across massive canvases in parks, at festivals or on temple grounds. There is music, motion, and drama, but also reverence. The brush, whether small or large, becomes a conductor of emotion. Some combine calligraphy with dance, others with painting or storytelling. And yet, in all these evolutions, the core remains: one stroke, one intention, one moment. In this way, calligraphy has never truly left the heart of Japanese life. It may look different from generation to generation. The tools may evolve, the forms may shift, but the act remains sacred. A brush touching paper is a timeless gesture. It reaches across ages, connecting past and present in one breath. To write is to remember, to pause, to be. And in that pause, something ancient and human is preserved, not in museums or libraries alone, but in living hearts and hands. That is where calligraphy endures, not as a relic, but as a rhythm. Beyond the brush, beyond the ink, beyond the paper itself, lies a space where Japanese calligraphy becomes more than art. It becomes philosophy. To understand this ancient practice fully, one must look not only at what is written, but at the principles behind each stroke. These are not simply aesthetic guidelines. They are reflections of how the Japanese mind approaches life, space, time, and meaning. At the heart of calligraphy is the concept of balance, not symmetry in the Western sense, but a fluid, asymmetrical harmony that allows each element to breathe. A character may lean slightly to the left or carry more weight on one side, but it is not considered off. Instead, it reflects the natural irregularity of life. This principle, known as fukinsei, or asymmetrical balance, is deeply rooted in Japanese aesthetics. It values the imperfect, the incomplete, the spontaneous. It teaches us to see beauty not in perfection, but in authenticity. Each stroke in calligraphy is expected to vary subtly in pressure, thickness, and rhythm. Uniformity is not the goal. Presence is bugon. The second essential principle is ma, or negative space. In Japanese calligraphy, what is not written is just as important as what is. The empty space around the characters, the blank areas within the strokes, the silence between words. These are not voids to be filled, but intentional pauses that shape the meaning of the whole. Ma invites the viewer to breathe, to listen, to feel. It embodies the idea that absence holds energy, that what is left unsaid can carry more weight than what is spoken. In calligraphy, this manifests as careful placement of characters on the page, generous margins, and deliberate gaps between lines. The brush pauses not only to rest, but to respect the silence. That silence, that openness, is where emotion often lives. Another guiding idea is shizen, or naturalness. This does not mean casual or careless, but rather the sense that a brushstroke arose organically, without force. A good calligraphy piece appears uncontrived, as if it came into being in a single breath, guided by the hand of someone fully in tune with themselves and the moment. This is why calligraphy is often done in one continuous flow. There is no erasing, no editing. What appears on the page is a reflection of that exact moment in time, of mood, of energy, of breath, and that honesty is sacred. Closely tied to this is yugen, or subtle mystery. Many calligraphy works, especially in the sosho or grass script, appear abstract to untrained eyes. The characters may be abbreviated, stylized, or even partially obscured. But this is not a flaw. It is an invitation. The viewer is not meant to read quickly or analytically, but to feel the piece, to wander through its curves, to sense what lies beneath the surface. This mystery is not confusing, but evocative. It leaves space for the imagination to dance. It trusts that beauty is not always in clarity, but in suggestion. Finally, there is wabi-sabi, the cherished Japanese worldview that embraces the transient, the aged, the weathered, and the humble. In calligraphy, this may appear in the faint bleed of ink into old paper, in the trembling of a brush held by elderly hands, in the irregular texture of handmade washi. These are not defects, they are fingerprints of time. And time in Japanese thought is a collaborator in the work. Even as the ink fades, the piece becomes more alive. A scroll left in a quiet room for decades, collecting dust and memory, is more than an object. It is a vessel of presence. The philosophy behind calligraphy is deeply aligned with the teachings of Zen Buddhism, where simplicity, mindfulness, and non-attachment are core. The practice of Hitsuzendo, or the way of Zen through the brush, blends meditation with art. Before writing, the calligrapher may sit in silence, steadying the breath. The brush is lifted with reverence. Each stroke flows not from thought, but from emptiness, a state of motion or no mind. In this state, the ego dissolves. The self becomes the brush. The paper becomes the world. And the act of writing becomes a gesture of union between inner and outer being. When one understands these principles, a simple character, just one word on a scroll, can carry the weight of an entire worldview. It might read kokoro, meaning heart or mind, or mu, meaning nothingness, or ichigo ichii, a Zen phrase that means one time, one meeting, a reminder that every moment is unique and never to be repeated. These are not just words, they are mirrors. And the way they are written, with weight, with pause, with care, transforms them into experiences, into moments of quiet encounter. In a modern world full of distractions, noise, and speed, these principles offer a way back. A way to see beauty in simplicity, to honor space, to accept imperfection, and to find stillness within movement. Japanese calligraphy is not about decoration or display. It is about presence. Each time a brush touches paper, it teaches a lesson, not in language, but in being. And that is why, after centuries, the art continues not only in galleries and schools, but in quiet hearts across the world. Because somewhere within the brushstroke, we remember how to be human. The brush moves in silence, guided by centuries of tradition and the quiet breath of the artist. The brush moves in silence, guided by centuries of tradition and the quiet breath of the artist. The brush moves in silence, guided by centuries of tradition and the quiet breath of the artist. The brush moves in silence, guided by centuries of tradition and the quiet breath of the artist. The brush moves in silence, guided by centuries of tradition and the quiet breath of the artist. The brush moves in silence, guided by centuries of tradition and the quiet breath of the artist. The brush moves in silence, guided by centuries of tradition and the quiet breath of the artist. The brush moves in silence, guided by centuries of tradition and the quiet breath of the artist. The brush moves in silence, guided by centuries of tradition and the quiet breath of the artist. The brush moves in silence, guided by centuries of tradition and the quiet breath of the artist. The brush moves in silence, guided by centuries of tradition and the quiet breath of the artist. The brush moves in silence, guided by centuries of tradition and the quiet breath of the artist. The brush moves in silence, guided by centuries of tradition and the quiet breath of the artist. The brush moves in silence, guided by centuries of tradition and the quiet breath of the artist. The brush moves in silence, guided by centuries of tradition and the quiet breath of the artist. The brush moves in silence, guided by centuries of tradition and the quiet breath of the artist. The brush moves in silence, guided by centuries of tradition and the quiet breath of the artist. The brush moves in silence, guided by centuries of tradition and the quiet breath of the artist. The brush moves in silence, guided by centuries of tradition and the quiet breath of the artist. The brush moves in silence, guided by centuries of tradition and the quiet breath of the artist. The brush moves in silence, guided by centuries of tradition and the quiet breath of the artist. The brush moves in silence, guided by centuries of tradition and the quiet breath of the artist. The brush moves in silence, guided by centuries of tradition and the quiet breath of the artist. The brush moves in silence, guided by centuries of tradition and the quiet breath of the artist. The brush moves in silence, guided by centuries of tradition and the quiet breath of the artist. The brush moves in silence, guided by centuries of tradition and the quiet breath of the artist. The brush moves in silence, guided by centuries of tradition and the quiet breath of the artist. The brush moves in silence, guided by centuries of tradition and the quiet breath of the artist. The brush moves in silence, guided by centuries of tradition and the quiet breath of the artist. The brush moves in silence, guided by centuries of tradition and the quiet breath of the artist. The brush moves in silence, guided by centuries of tradition and the quiet breath of the artist. The brush moves in silence, guided by centuries of tradition and the quiet breath of the artist. The brush moves in silence, guided by centuries of tradition and the quiet breath of the artist. The brush moves in silence, guided by centuries of tradition and the quiet breath of the artist. The brush moves in silence, guided by centuries of tradition and the quiet breath of the artist. The brush moves in silence, guided by centuries of tradition and the quiet breath of the artist. The brush moves in silence, guided by centuries of tradition and the quiet breath of the artist. The brush moves in silence, guided by centuries of tradition and the quiet breath of the artist. The brush moves in silence, guided by centuries of tradition and the quiet breath of the artist. The brush moves in silence, guided by centuries of tradition and the quiet breath of the artist. The brush moves in silence, guided by centuries of tradition and the quiet breath of the artist. The brush moves in silence, guided by centuries of tradition and the quiet breath of the artist. The brush moves in silence, guided by centuries of tradition and the quiet breath of the artist. The brush moves in silence, guided by centuries of tradition and the quiet breath of the artist. The brush moves in silence, guided by centuries of tradition and the quiet breath of the artist. The brush moves in silence, guided by centuries of tradition and the quiet breath of the artist. The brush moves in silence, guided by centuries of tradition and the quiet breath of the artist. The brush moves in silence, guided by centuries of tradition and the quiet breath of the artist. The brush moves in silence, guided by centuries of tradition and the quiet breath of the artist. The brush moves in silence, guided by centuries of tradition and the quiet breath of the artist. The brush moves in silence, guided by centuries of tradition and the quiet breath of the artist. The brush moves in silence, guided by centuries of tradition and the quiet breath of the artist. The brush moves in silence, guided by centuries of tradition and the quiet breath of the artist. In the final centuries of Japan's classical age, the art of calligraphy quietly evolved, not with grand transformations, but through the slow accumulation of detail, wisdom, and grace. During the Edo period, which began in the early 17th century and extended into the 19th, Japan experienced a rare and prolonged peace under the rule of the Tokugawa shogunate. It was during this time, with travel restricted and the country largely closed to foreign influence, that cultural practices such as calligraphy were refined, preserved, and gently adapted to meet the needs of a new era. The samurai class, once warriors, were gradually transformed into scholars, bureaucrats, and teachers. With their swords increasingly ceremonial, many found new identity in the arts, and calligraphy became one of the most esteemed of those pursuits. A warrior's strength was no longer measured only in battle, but in his ability to control his brush, to master poetry, and to embody restraint. Calligraphy, with its demands for discipline, patience, and calm, provided the perfect arena for such inward cultivation. Schools of calligraphy, once tied closely to religious institutions, began to operate more independently. Masters took on students not only from elite families, but also from the rising merchant class, and even among women. While the formal scripts continued to be taught, kaisho for clarity, gyosho for fluency, sosho for expression, the Edo period also encouraged personal styles. Calligraphy became not only a way to transmit ideas, but to express character. The way one wrote a character, its pressure, its looseness, its tilt, these subtleties spoke volumes about the writer's spirit, mood, and refinement. In the tea houses of Kyoto, where aesthetics governed every detail, calligraphy scrolls were carefully chosen to reflect the tone of the season, the mood of the host, or the occasion being marked. A single brushstroke, framed by space, offered a quiet dialogue between writer and reader. In a culture that prized suggestion over declaration, the scroll became a kind of whispered conversation. The materials of calligraphy also evolved during this time. The quality of brushes improved. Some had hairs made from goat, others from weasel or deer, each offering different resilience and flow. The ink was still ground by hand from solid blocks, but variations in composition, scent, and texture allowed for greater nuance. Paper, known as washi, reached new levels of subtlety, thinner, stronger, and more absorbent. It allowed the brush to leave traces not just on the surface, but within the very fibers of the sheet. Great care was taken in choosing these materials. A master calligrapher might spend as much time preparing as writing, selecting the right ink, testing the brush's response, considering the season, the message, the recipient. These decisions were acts of mindfulness. Calligraphy was no longer only about letters, it was a way of being. In the later Edo period, a revival of ancient Chinese classics brought renewed attention to Confucian texts, and copying these texts in careful calligraphy became an honored scholarly pursuit. At the same time, Zen monks continued their spontaneous, expressive style, creating bold, abstract works meant less to be read and more to be felt. This duality, the precise and the free, defined Japanese calligraphy's richness. Even outside religious or scholarly contexts, calligraphy found a place in everyday life. Invitations, shop signs, even product labels were handwritten with care. A single glance at the script could signal refinement, trustworthiness, or prestige. Calligraphy was not hidden in books, but lived in the public eye, a part of the visual texture of daily life. As Japan moved toward modernization in the late 19th century, and the Meiji Restoration opened the country to the West, many traditional arts faced uncertainty. Western typography, printing presses, and Roman letters began to appear in public signage and official documents. Yet calligraphy, rather than vanish, found new relevance. It was preserved in schools, adapted into textbooks, and held up as a symbol of Japanese identity amidst rapid change. Artists began to see it not only as a means of writing, but as a form of abstract expression. In this way, Japanese calligraphy entered the modern age not as a relic, but as a living thread, quiet, enduring, and full of breath. As the 20th century unfolded and Japan moved through rapid industrialization, world wars, Reconstruction, and into the digital age, many of its traditional practices were challenged by the rush of modernity. The old ways, slow, deliberate, intimate, stood in stark contrast to the fast, mechanical pace of the New World. Yet somehow, Japanese calligraphy did not fade into obscurity. Instead, it found a quiet strength in the margins, in the spaces where modern life had no words, only breath. In post-war Japan, calligraphy became not just a cultural artifact, but a meditative art form that offered solace. Schools across the country continued to teach the fundamentals, and competitions were held to encourage young people to preserve the tradition. For many students, learning calligraphy was a rite of passage, a way to understand discipline not through punishment, but through repetition, stillness, and control. At the same time, avant-garde artists began pushing the boundaries of what calligraphy could be. They treated the brush not only as a writing tool, but as a channel of movement. Some painted on walls, others used massive brushes dipped in black ink to sweep across floors. These performances merged dance, painting, and language into a single, fleeting act. Though controversial at times, this expansion breathed new life into the tradition, reminding the world that calligraphy was not static. It could evolve. In the latter half of the century, as Japan embraced its global identity, calligraphy became an ambassador. Exhibitions traveled to Europe and North America, where audiences marveled at the fluid grace of kanji brushed on silk. Museums in Paris, New York, and London began collecting not only ancient scrolls, but contemporary pieces that blended calligraphy with modern art. The West, fascinated by Zen aesthetics and minimalism, saw in Japanese calligraphy a kind of spiritual clarity. The strokes were more than lines. They were expressions of presence. In Japanese homes, calligraphy continued to hold quiet significance. Scrolls were still hung in alcoves known as tokonoma, often accompanied by a seasonal flower or incense burner. The choice of character, the spacing, the balance, it was never random. A single word, written in silence, could set the tone for an entire room. It might mean tranquility, dawn, or simply tea. Guests would pause, notice, perhaps bow slightly. These gestures were not about reading, but about feeling. In the modern era, digital technology has entered even the world of calligraphy. Artists now use tablets and styluses to simulate brush movement, and calligraphic fonts attempt to capture the spontaneity of hand-drawn characters. While some purists resist these changes, others embrace them as a new canvas. Online communities of calligraphy enthusiasts now share their work across borders, bridging time zones through the quiet swish of imagined ink. Children learn through apps, teachers demonstrate techniques through videos, and traditional knowledge finds new life through screenlight. And yet, amidst all this evolution, something remains unchanged. The brush is still held vertically, the breath is still centered, the first stroke is still preceded by stillness. The paper is still respected, never wasted. In this way, Japanese calligraphy continues to teach not only writing, but a way of living. A rhythm that resists haste, a silence that speaks. Today, you might find calligraphy in a museum, a temple, a child's school desk, or on the wall of a tiny apartment in Tokyo. You might see it tattooed on skin, printed on fabric, or flashing across a subway ad. It lives in all these places and more, not because it shouts, but because it endures, quietly, patiently, with dignity. It asks for nothing, offers no distraction, and rewards only those who pause long enough to see. And so, as we close this gentle journey through time, we remember that calligraphy is not simply about letters or language. It is about presence. A line that begins with breath, travels through the hand, and ends in stillness. A tradition that whispers across centuries. And when the ink dries and the paper is rolled away, the space that remains is not empty. It is full of everything we did not say. And that, perhaps, is the most beautiful part of all. And so, our quiet journey through the art of Japanese calligraphy gently comes to an end. But before we drift into the next sleepy tale, if you're still here, resting, relaxed, and listening, would you mind leaving a soft little like and maybe subscribing? It helps us continue sharing these peaceful stories, night after night. Now, stay just as still, keep the volume low, and let us continue our journey through forgotten histories. As we slowly turn the page to our next story in the Boring History for Sleep series, The Forgotten Empires of Central America. Let us begin. Long before Spanish ships touched the coasts of Central America, the dense jungles and volcanic highlands cradled civilizations of remarkable sophistication. Among these were the Maya, whose pyramids rose above the treetops like stone mountains, their temples aligned with the stars, their cities humming with ritual and reason. But beyond the Maya, in quieter valleys and on misty plateaus, thrived other forgotten peoples, builders, astronomers, and poets, whose names echo only faintly through the ruins. From the mysterious stone spheres of Costa Rica to the trade outposts that dotted the isthmus, Central America was more than a crossroads. It was a cradle of empire. Their stories were etched not only into stelae and clay, but into the rhythm of rain on palm leaves, the chants carried on the wind, the silence of abandoned plazas reclaimed by vines. Even now, archaeologists stumble upon hidden sites, swallowed by time, where stairways rise to nowhere, and plazas whisper of once grand ceremonies. These empires did not fall uphill in a blaze of glory. Many dissolved slowly, their people dispersing, their temples left to the care of moss and tree roots. And while the world remembers Tikal or Copan, lesser-known centers like El Baul or Cihuatan remain obscured, their histories barely pieced together from fragments of pottery and broken glyphs. Yet in those fragments lie clues to grand narratives, of kings who reigned without metal, of cities without wheels, of calendars more precise than any in Europe at the time. It is easy to romanticize their disappearance, to call them vanished, but in truth, their descendants live on, their language shaping the speech of modern villages, their rituals folded into Christian feast days. This is the story not of loss, but of transformation, of how culture can endure by changing form, how the past lingers not just in ruins, but in the people who still walk the paths their ancestors paved. As we begin this journey into the forgotten empires of Central America, we start not with conquest, but with quietness, with the slow layering of centuries, the steady breath of forest reclaiming stone. Let us wander gently into these histories, not with haste or drama, but with reverence for what remains and curiosity for what is still hidden. And in doing so, may we find rest in the rhythm of old stories, told softly, slowly, until sleep takes hold. To understand the forgotten empires of Central America, one must first listen to the land, the way rivers curve around ancient causeways, the way mountains cradle cities built from memory and stone. Take, for instance, the site of Caminaljuyu, once a thriving highland city located in what is now Guatemala City. Long before Spanish cathedrals rose on the same soil, this place held markets, temples, and palaces built from volcanic rock. Its people were skilled in irrigation, creating canal systems that guided water through fields and neighborhoods, feeding both crops and communities. Though largely obscured by modern urban sprawl, Caminaljuyu whispers of an era where knowledge flowed with the rivers and belief shaped architecture. Elsewhere, in the region now known as El Salvador, the city of Cihuatan flourished briefly but brightly. Surrounded by defensive walls, its central plazas once hosted ceremonies under the gaze of sculpted deities. Its sudden abandonment remains a quiet mystery, one the jungle has wrapped in vines and silence. Further south in Costa Rica, stone spheres, some perfectly round, lie scattered in fields and forests, their creators still unknown, their purpose still debated. These were not isolated curiosities, but signs of a people capable of advanced geometry and shared vision. Across this land, empires formed not around conquest, but around trade, astronomy, and ceremony. Their calendars tracked the stars with precision. Their stories passed through generations in chants and carved glyphs. Though many of these cities lacked massive monuments, their cultural legacy was no less profound. They lived in harmony with their environment, building with stone and earth, weaving textiles dyed with natural colors, shaping belief systems tied to the rhythms of the natural world. And while many of their names are lost, their fingerprints remain, in pottery unearthed, in roads uncovered, in rituals remembered by descendants who still offer corn to the gods at sunrise. It is not merely about ruins, but about recognition. That the past lingers quietly, even when ignored. That history does not always shout. It sometimes hums beneath the surface, waiting for those who will listen. Not all stories of empire are written in conquest and crowns. Some are carved in obsidian, painted in ochre, and sung by voices that never reached European ears. In the highlands of Honduras, the lesser-known city of Los Naranjos thrived near Lake Yojoa, its people creating ceramic wares that carried geometric stories passed from hand to hand. Archaeologists have uncovered burial mounds and ceremonial platforms, testifying to a culture that honored ancestors and watched the sky with reverence. Farther north, near the borders of present-day Nicaragua, remnants of the Ometepe culture still rest beneath volcanic ash. Villages that once buzzed with daily rituals, storytelling fires, and communal labor. They built without great stones or massive pyramids, but with organization, with shared mythologies, and with spiritual maps that aligned lives to the natural flow of sun and rain. Artifacts found deep in the earth, beads, carved pendants, clay figurines, reveal not a people primitive, but a people in tune. Theirs were lives not of opulence, but of balance, where time was kept not by clock, but by season, and worth was measured in harmony rather than gold. In many of these regions, knowledge was not held by warriors, but by shamans and sages who remembered stories through stars and encoded ethics into chants. A simple cornmeal offering at dusk could summon centuries of tradition. A fire lit on the solstice could mark not just the turning of the year, but a cosmic rhythm. Even in places long deemed unremarkable by modern eyes, there lay invisible networks of meaning, paths connecting villages, ideas traveling through trade, and ceremonies reflecting cosmic balance. Many of these cultures left no grand monuments, yet their worldview endures like an undercurrent, shaping the ways descendants farm, pray, and speak to the land. What we now call forgotten was once the center of someone's universe, the heart of a people's story. And to walk slowly across those grassy mounds, to run fingers along an ancient pot's etching, is to sense the presence of lives that pulsed with clarity, even in simplicity. These were civilizations of rhythm, more than roar, of constellations more than conquest. The power of these ancient cultures often lay not in their weaponry or expansion, but in their relationship with the land and the sky. In places like Chalchuapa, located in what is now western El Salvador, excavations have revealed layers of ritual life woven into the very soil. At the site of Tazumal, stepped pyramids rise from grassy knolls, bearing the marks of centuries of reconstruction and reverence. Here, the past was not static. It was constantly honored, rebuilt, repainted, reimagined with each generation that passed. Fragments of incense burners and sculpted gods speak of a people who believed deeply in the permeability between worlds, that ancestors lingered, that the gods could be invited to feast. Farther west, the Izalcos region held sacred caves and natural springs that played central roles in pilgrimage and seasonal celebration. These were not cultures disconnected from their environment, but intimately synchronized with it. Their cities followed the contours of the earth, their sacred sites aligned with the sun's journey, their rituals echoing the turning of the stars. Trade routes crisscrossed these lands, from the Pacific coast to the volcanic ranges inland, carrying obsidian blades, cacao beans, jade ornaments, and stories. These routes were more than economic. They were connective tissue, linking languages, customs, and mythologies across miles and mountains. As merchants walked these ancient paths, they carried not just goods, but meaning. Gods of one region translated into songs of another, symbols reinterpreted in new places. This was not a world of isolation, but of exchange, fluid, adaptive, layered. And yet, unlike imperial centers built on domination, many of these societies endured through balance, not force. They sought harmony rather than hegemony. Even political leadership often blended secular and sacred, with rulers serving as both administrators and spiritual guides. Power in these places was not absolute. It was earned, honored, and sometimes relinquished for the greater good. To peer into the world of these forgotten empires is to recognize that greatness is not always measured by stone alone. Across Central America, communities developed sophisticated systems of knowledge that rivaled those of more widely remembered civilizations. Astronomy played a central role, not merely for celestial curiosity, but as a guide for planting, for ceremony, and for shaping time itself. In places like Copan, near the modern border of Honduras and Guatemala, time was carved into stelae, tall stone slabs etched with dates that marked kingships, eclipses, and divine cycles. These carvings were not mere records. They were rituals in stone, aligning the human and the cosmic in shared rhythm. Calendrical systems were rich and layered, often involving simultaneous counts that tracked sacred and solar time. Priests and mathematicians held these cycles in mind, ensuring that rituals took place at precise moments when the energies of the heavens aligned with those of the earth. Even smaller settlements without towering monuments followed these principles, their architecture reflecting the position of the solstice sun or the orientation of key constellations. Beyond the stars, the medical traditions of these societies were equally profound. Herbal remedies, sweat lodges, spiritual cleansings, and dietary practices reflected a holistic view of health, one that saw the body, the spirit, and the land as deeply connected. Elders were the keepers of this wisdom, and many still pass it down in hushed tones under the same trees where their ancestors once gathered. Language, too, carried power. Many of these cultures used pictographic scripts, visual languages that encoded story, law, myth, and science. Though some scripts remain undeciphered, their symmetry and beauty reveal a refined logic, a way of thinking in pattern and metaphor. Even where writing did not dominate, oral storytelling ensured that history lived in the mouths of the people, woven into lullabies, proverbs, and festival chants. Theirs was not a history lost, but a memory held differently, passed not through books, but through breath, through drumbeats and footsteps in the dust. But as with many civilizations, the story of these empires was not only one of growth and brilliance, but of pressure, change, and eventual fading into the mist of time. Environmental shifts played their part. Climate variations, prolonged droughts, and volcanic eruptions periodically disrupted the delicate balance between human life and the natural rhythms they depended upon. Evidence from lake sediment cores and pollen analysis suggests that major droughts may have struck key regions between the 7th and 10th centuries, drying up water sources, shortening growing seasons, and contributing to food scarcity. As resources became more limited, some settlements likely migrated, while others faced internal tensions, fragmenting leadership and weakening traditional structures of cooperation. Trade routes that once hummed with constant movement slowed to a trickle, ceremonial centers were gradually abandoned, and sacred plazas returned to silence. Archaeological traces suggest not a dramatic collapse, but a gradual dispersal, a turning inward as external connections frayed. At the same time, new waves of influence were arriving from the north and south, carrying not just goods, but ideologies and pressures for consolidation. Rivalries and shifting alliances may have further tested the resilience of local governance, and with time, the complexity that once defined these societies became harder to sustain. Artisans no longer carved elaborate symbols into jade or fired ornate pottery at the same scale. Temples once painted in vibrant reds and blues slowly faded under sun and rain, and once busy markets became overgrown paths. Still, decline did not mean disappearance. Many people remained, adapting to new realities, blending traditions with newer ones, preserving old wisdom in subtle gestures, in whispered prayers, and in seasonal customs. While the grandeur of state structures may have receded, the spirit of the people endured, surviving conquests yet to come. By the time European ships loomed on the horizon centuries later, these civilizations had already undergone quiet revolutions, transformations shaped not by war or empire, but by weather, by ecology, and by the enduring will to live. Though the monumental cities of Central America may have quieted, the cultural heartbeat of its people continued to echo through generations. In remote villages nestled among the hills, elders continued to tell stories by firelight, myths of sky serpents, rain gods, and underworld journeys that shaped both identity and ritual. These tales were not mere entertainments, they were mnemonic maps, preserving cosmologies and moral lessons across centuries. Many communities maintained agricultural practices that dated back thousands of years, rotating crops, honoring planting cycles, and invoking ancestral blessings before harvest. Corn, beans, squash, these were not simply sustenance, but symbols of spiritual harmony, of life interwoven with land. Healers still consulted the moon and used plant medicines passed down through matrilineal memory, choosing herbs by scent, touch, and intuition honed through generations. Dances performed in seasonal festivals recalled celestial patterns and sacred histories, their rhythm and movement echoing those carved long ago into temple walls. Even in the weaving of cloth, ancient symbols persisted, diamond patterns representing the four cardinal directions, zigzags for rivers and winds, repeating borders for eternity. These textiles were more than garments. They were living codices, stitched with memory and meaning. Languages, too, remained resilient, spoken softly in markets, whispered in lullabies, chanted during rites of passage. Some dialects bent and evolved, borrowing words, adapting syntax, yet retaining a core that linked them to their ancient roots. Through all this, identity was not erased, but transformed, neither fixed nor broken, but adaptive, layered, and quietly enduring. Long before written histories attempted to define these people, they had already written themselves into the earth, the stars, and the fabric of daily life. As the centuries passed, the legacies of Central America's forgotten empires became intertwined with layers of conquest, resistance, and resilience. When the first European ships arrived on distant shores, they brought with them not just unfamiliar tools and languages, but ideologies that would test the cultural fabric of the continent. The Spanish conquest unraveled entire political orders, seized temples, redrew borders, and introduced foreign diseases that decimated populations. But while cities fell, memory did not. In the hushed silence of the mountains, tradition slipped underground, becoming hidden threads within a rapidly changing tapestry. Festivals once held to honor maize gods were recast as saints' days, their dances and colors intact, their meanings quietly intact beneath Christian names. Ceremonial grounds were converted into church plazas, yet the stones beneath them still hummed with old purpose. In kitchens, women folded histories into tamales and stews, their recipes echoing ancestral offerings once placed at sacred altars. Language endured even under pressure. Though colonial policies sought to standardize communication, indigenous tongues survived, whispered in market stalls, spoken around fires, sung by grandmothers to newborns. In remote valleys and highland villages, bilingualism became a quiet act of defiance, a way to speak two worlds at once, one imposed, one inherited. Artisans continued to shape clay, carve wood, and weave textiles, often blending traditional forms with new symbols, creating hybrid expressions that honored both ancestry and adaptation. Even under colonial surveillance, healing practices endured, blending native herbs with introduced remedies, expanding an already rich understanding of the body and spirit. Resistance was not always loud. It was in persistence, in the refusal to forget, in the subtle act of remembering through everyday rituals. Though history books often focus on the conquerors, the story beneath the surface tells of a people who endured by shaping change rather than surrendering to it. By the dawn of the modern era, echoes of the ancient empires still lingered, not only in stone and soil, but in hearts, names, rhythms, and beliefs that had quietly persisted for centuries. Scholars, travelers, and explorers began documenting ruins buried beneath jungle canopies, stunned by the mathematical precision of pyramids, the complexity of glyphs, and the architectural grandeur of forgotten cities. While many interpreted these remains through a European lens, Local communities had long known their meaning. Some had passed down knowledge orally, some had incorporated sacred sites into daily life, blending reverence with routine. What was discovered was often never truly lost. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, interest in the pre-Columbian world surged, but this was often filtered through romanticism or colonial ambition. Archaeological excavations unearthed murals, ceramics, and ceremonial altars, yet also dislodged graves, disrespected sites, and removed sacred objects to faraway museums. Amid these tensions, descendants of the original builders watched strangers interpret their history, sometimes with care, often without consent. Still, within families and villages, the old knowledge flowed, embedded in lullabies, in stories told before sleep, in seasonal ceremonies marked not by written calendars, but by wind, sun, and rain. While outsiders pieced together timelines from stone, the living memory of these civilizations moved quietly forward through practice, repetition, and resilience. Art forms that once adorned royal courts now adorned homes. Languages that once shaped royal decrees now carried blessings, jokes, lullabies, and the names of stars. It was not merely about preservation, but continuity, an unbroken thread of identity spun from millennia of change. Though temples might crumble and dynasties fall, the soul of a people remains in how they care for the land, how they honor the past without freezing it, how they raise children with stories not of endings, but of endurance. In today's Central America, the remnants of forgotten empires are not merely preserved in ruins or museums, but in the living pulse of daily life, a subtle fusion of the past and present that shapes identity in both seen and unseen ways. Children still learn to count in Mayan numbers, their fingers mimicking ancient glyphs once carved into limestone walls. Market stalls bustle with embroidered fabrics that carry patterns passed down through generations, their colors tied to regional stories, myths, and beliefs. Rainy seasons are greeted not just with the umbrellas, but with old prayers murmured in native tongues, asking the sky for mercy and balance. In classrooms, teachers now blend state curricula with indigenous history, slowly reweaving erased narratives into official memory. Community leaders organize festivals, honoring both Catholic saints and ancestral gods, not as contradictions, but as layered identities coexisting in harmony. Young musicians blend marimba rhythms with modern instruments, composing songs that carry the cadence of forgotten dynasties into a digital age. There is a quiet revolution in reclaiming what was silenced. Activists restoring native place names, scholars teaching ancient scripts, artists painting murals that revive legendary battles, migrations, and cosmologies. Old temples are visited not only by tourists, but by locals leaving flowers, incense, and whispers, a continued reverence for spirits believed never to have left. Modern struggles against poverty, displacement, or environmental change are framed through ancestral wisdom, reminding people that survival is a legacy deeply rooted in their soil. Every woven belt, every traditional dish, every song or dance becomes a thread in a larger tapestry, one that continues to grow, adapt, and remember. The story of these empires is not finished. It breathes in those who walk their lands, sing their legends, speak their syllables. Though kingdoms may fall and borders shift, what truly lasts are the whispers that live in memory, the rituals that mark time, and the deep, unshakable knowledge that identity is more than a name. It is a feeling, a rhythm, a quiet but enduring flame.